Can I ask those who are leaving the chamber to do so quietly, please? And the next item of business is a debate on motion 5283 in the name of Derek Mackay on the Air Departure Tax Scotland Bill at stage 1. May I ask those who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons, and I call on Derek Mackay to speak to and move the motion. Up to 13 minutes, please, Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I am delighted to open the Stage 1 debate on the Air Departure Tax Scotland Bill. The devolution of powers over air passenger duty to the Scottish Parliament was recommended by the Smith Commission in November 2014. Following the passage of the Scotland Act 2016, the Scottish Parliament now has the power to legislate for air departure tax, which will replace APD in Scotland. In the programme for government, the Scottish Government announced that a bill would be introduced to establish a tax to replace APD in Scotland. The Air Departure Tax Scotland Bill was subsequently introduced on the 19th of December 2016, delivering on this commitment. Under terms agreed between the Scottish and UK governments in the fiscal framework, APD will cease to apply in Scotland from the 1st of April 2018. The block grant will be adjusted downwards, and if this bill is enacted, ADT will replace it from that date. Separately, the Scottish Fiscal Commission will assume responsibility for producing independent forecasts of receipts from ADT for future Scottish Government budgets. These forecasts will reflect the Scottish Government's policy for ADT at that time. The bill establishes the general structure and operation of ADT, which is a tax to be charged on the carriage of passengers on flights that begin in Scotland. The tax will apply only for the carriage of chargeable passengers on chargeable aircraft and will be payable by the aircraft operator. Revenue Scotland, Scotland's tax authority for devolved taxes, will be responsible for the collection and management of ADT, as it has done efficiently and effectively since the 1st of April 2015 for Scotland's other currently devolved taxes, Land and Building Transaction Tax and the Scottish Landfill Tax. The bill, as introduced, also includes powers for Scottish ministers to set tax exemptions, tax rate amounts and tax bans through secondary legislation, and I'll say more on exemptions later. Setting tax bans and tax rate amounts in subordinate legislation is consistent with the approach adopted in relation to other devolved taxes. The Scottish Government is seeking parliamentary approval for the bill in advance of the summer recess, and with the core foundations of the tax in place, will then bring forward tax rate amounts and tax bans through secondary legislation in the autumn. This secondary legislation will be subject to the affirmative procedure, meaning Parliament will have an opportunity to scrutinise tax band and tax rate amount proposals at a later date, and they cannot come into effect without Parliament's approval. In future years, tax bands and tax rate amounts, of course, just after I make this point, in future years, tax bands and tax rate amounts will be set as part of the budget process, consistent with existing practice for other devolved taxes. I give way.
James Kelly.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for giving way. At what point in this process are you going to outline the cuts that are going to have to be made to the Scottish budget for the up to £189 million less that's going to be in the budget as a result of the introduction of a policy of reducing ADT by 50%?
Derek Mackay.
Well, I'm just coming to the policy intention, and of course I'll engage with the wider community, with Parliament, political parties in the sector to understand and outline our position. But when it's clear that this government has had a long-standing commitment to delivering a 50% reduction in the overall burden of ADT by the end of this parliamentary session and to abolishing the taxes when resources allow, that's a long-standing position to support our economy. Now, these plans are a key part of the, of course.
Patrick Harvey.
I'm grateful to the member. You see, this is the central contradiction in the bill. The Minister is now saying that they're going to conduct a discussion with all the parties, they're going to conduct economic analysis. Surely that is what you do before deciding what your tax policy is going to be. What on earth is the rationale for deciding on a tax policy before you have a clue what the impact of it is actually going to be?
Derek Mackay.
The Scottish Government's been clear we support this position, and we've looked at the evidence, and what I've been asked to do is expand expand on independent evidence, and I've said to the committee that I'm willing to do that. But these plans are a key part of the Scottish Government's economic strategy, in particular boosting trade, investment, influence and networks, which is especially important given the economic threat posed by Brexit. Scotland's airports are competing on a world stage to secure new routes and capacity, and reducing the tax burden helps ensure that there's a more level playing field, with many other European airports competing to secure the same airlines and similar routes. New routes will enhance business connectivity and tourism, but again, what we're proposing today is the foundations of the tax. I will return to tax rates and bans in due course, as is the case with other devolved taxes. And as is the case with other currently devolved taxes, the Scottish Government has taken and will continue to take a consultative and collaborative approach to engaging stakeholders on how ADT should be structured and operated. We've published a policy consultation last year which generated a range of views, and since then we've worked carefully to refine our legislative proposals reflecting on the responses received. In addition to this, we established a stakeholder forum in August 2015, which I chair, to provide input into the development of our policy and legislative proposals for ADT. Revenue Scotland is also taking a collaborative approach to stakeholder engagement and is actively working with aircraft operators and others on matters relating to the collection and management of ADT, such as ICT and guidance. The Scottish Government has also listened to the responses from the Finance and Constitution Committee that they received during consideration of the bill at stage 1. And I would like to thank both the Finance and Constitution Committee and the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee for the detailed scrutiny of the bill and for their conclusions and recommendations in their stage 1 reports. The Scottish Government welcomes the Finance and Constitution Committee's support for the general principles of the bill. Last Friday, I responded to all the issues raised and the recommendations made in the committee's report, and I would like to highlight some of the key aspects of that response. The Scottish Government agrees with the committee and stakeholders that it is important that our plans for ADT are supported by robust evidence and the impacts are monitored over time. So firstly, the Scottish Government has therefore commenced the commissioning of an independent economic assessment of the Government's plans for a 50% reduction in the overall ADT burden by the end of this parliamentary session. If I can make some more progress, and then I'll maybe take a further intervention. The assessment will report in the autumn, no later than when the Government sets out its secondary legislation plans for tax rates, amounts and tax bands. In addition to this analysis, a robust monitoring and evaluation framework will be put in place for assessing the economic impact of ADT in the future. Secondly, the Scottish Government has listened to the environmental concerns about our ADT plans, which have been raised by some respondents. The Scottish Government is already committed to undertaking a full strategic environmental assessment of our ADT reduction plans. An example of good practice, openness and transparency, the screening and scoping report was made available last year for full public comment. The next main step of the SEA process is to publicly consult on the Scottish Government's plan for an overall 50% ADT reduction, along with an accompanying environmental report. The environmental report will outline the findings of the assessment of the plan against a wide range of environmental topics such as climate factors, air quality and biodiversity. As well as the SEA, the Scottish Government is currently undertaking quantitative assessments on the likely greenhouse gas emission and noise impacts of our overall 50% reduction plan. The noise assessment will be published in the autumn, no later than when the Government sets out its secondary legislation plans for the ADT tax rates, amounts and bands that will apply from the 1st of April 2018. I'll take an intervention from Mike Rumbles.
Mike Rumbles.
Minister, giving way. So far, the Finance Minister hasn't mentioned the fact that Transport Scotland have concluded that this will mean 60,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide emissions going into the atmosphere every year. Don't you think that is a rather important point that you seem so far to have omitted?
Derek Mackay.
Well, in giving further detailed evidence to committee and others, the Government's made it clear that yes, we will need to work harder in other areas of the environment and in transport, recognising the impact on emissions from this policy, whilst also aiming to achieve our very ambitious climate change targets. It will be published, as the information will be published as supporting information to the SEA consultation on the Scottish Government's approach. If I can now turn to exemptions and the Highlands and Islands issue, a matter very important to many. Whilst there is a case for considering exemptions alongside tax bans and tax rate amounts, an exemption effectively being a zero rate, the Scottish Government has listened carefully to stakeholders, the Finance and Constitution Committee and the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee, and will bring forward amendments at Stage 2, providing for passenger and aircraft exemptions. I would like to, at this point, bring to Parliament's attention an important policy and legal matter concerning the introduction of an ADT exemption for passengers flying from Highlands and Islands airports. A similar exemption has applied under APD since 2001, and the Scottish Government strongly supports retaining a like-for-like exemption under ADT and is interested in suggestions made during Stage 1 for enhancing the exemption. As ADT is a new tax devolved under the Scotland Act 2016, the Scottish Parliament is legislating for the first time on this matter. And after careful consideration, the Scottish Government's view is that such an exemption has to be notified to and assessed by the European Commission under state aid rules before it is implemented in compliance with European Union law. The Scottish Government will work closely with the UK Government to resolve this matter. The UK, as a EU member state, is responsible for notifying the exemption to the European Commission. I've spoken to the Secretary of State for Scotland as well as Treasury on this matter, and I'm exploring alternative solutions. I will, of course, ensure both Parliament and stakeholders are kept regularly updated on the matter. In conclusion, taken together, the provisions in the bill provide the basis for a tax that is well understood by taxpayers and is simple and efficient to collect and manage. The secondary legislation powers in the bill, subject in most circumstances to the affirmative procedure, provide sufficient legislative flexibility to make future changes to the tax in order to support key government policies to reflect changing market conditions or in light of Revenue Scotland's operational experience of collecting and managing the tax. There is general support from stakeholders, and I support in this chamber too, to the principles of the bill and the establishment of a tax to replace APD in Scotland. And I do appreciate that underneath that support there are a range of views about whether or not the tax should be reduced and indeed how that tax reduction should be applied to maximise the economic benefit for Scotland. And the Government remains of the view that our approach, whereby the overall burden of the tax is reduced by 50% by the end of this session of Parliament, and the tax is then abolished when resources allow, will deliver strong economic benefits for Scotland. So I look forward to debating these and other issues this afternoon. I invite the Parliament to approve the general principles of the Air Departure Tax Scotland Bill, and I move that the Parliament agrees to the general principles of the Air Departure Tax Scotland Bill.
I now call on Bruce Crawford to speak on behalf of the Finance and Constitution Committee. Up to 8 minutes, please, Mr Crawford.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It's my pleasure to speak in this debate as the convener of the Finance and Constitution Committee. Presiding Officer, as I commence my contribution today, I'd like to put on record my thanks to my fellow committee members for the constructive manner in which they went about the deliberations in regard to the ADT bill. I can also pay tribute to the professionalism of the clerking team in assisting us in our scrutiny of the legislation, and thank all of the stakeholders for their contributions. The Air Departure Tax Bill marks another important step, perhaps a milestone, or even, dare I say it, a new departure in the implementation of the Scotland Act 2016. The Finance and Constitution Committee, in scrutinising the bill, recognises the bill as essentially an enabling bill. That is, the bill provides the means to tax passengers departing from Scottish airports where the UK air departure passenger duty is disapplied in Scotland with effect from April 2018. Without this bill, passengers leaving from Scottish airports would be able to fly untaxed. Now, I know that some of you will think that's a good idea, where others will not. Whatever views exist, the committee supports the legislation enabling such a tax to be levied in Scotland. Yes, I certainly will.
Patrick Harvey.
I'm grateful. I'm sure the convener of the committee would recognise that the accurate description would be if no such bill is passed, then that would be the situation. We don't have to pass this bill. If this bill was to fall, the government would be forced to come back with a better one.
Bruce Crawford.
Well, you can't deny that logic, so there's no point in having a fight about something nobody would disagree with. But the committee has made a range of recommendations in its Stage 1 report on the bill, but I'll not have time to address all of these in my speech today. I do, however, wish to comment on the main issues, the three specific issues which emerged during the committee's scrutiny of the bill and where the committee considered improvements could be made. These issues are firstly the evidence base for the proposed 50% reduction in ADT during the current parliamentary session, secondly how outcomes will be monitored, and thirdly how the exemptions to ADT will be dealt with. Presiding Officer, although not actually part of the bill itself, the committee considered the Scottish Government's stated policy intention to reduce ADT by 50% and ultimately to abolish ADT when resources allow. I think it's fair to say that during the course of our deliberations, the lack of the required level of an evidence base regarding the economic impact of the proposed 50% reduction was a recurring theme. As a result, the committee recommended that the Scottish Government commission an independent economic analysis of the proposed reduction in ADT. I welcome the fact that the Cabinet Secretary's response to the committee, he's confirmed that the Scottish Government has commenced the commissioning of such an independent economic analysis. To date, the Scottish Government has not set out the tax rates and bans for ADT that it intends to apply. At the same time as publishing the proposed tax rates and bans, the committee also recommended that the forecast of the impact of the proposed 50% reduction on the Scottish budget to 21-22 should be also published alongside the rates and bans. I therefore welcome the Scottish Government's response that it will indeed provide a forecast of the impact on the Scottish budget at the same time as it sets out its secondary legislation plans for the ADT tax rates and bans that will apply from April 2018. In a similar vein, the Scottish Government is required to publish a strategic environmental assessment alongside the tax rates and bans. In this regard, we consider that the Scottish Government should publish an analysis of the likely increase in carbon emissions arising from the proposed 50% reduction as part of the strategic environmental assessment. Again, I therefore welcome the Cabinet Secretary's response that a quantitative assessment of the greenhouse gas emissions will be published alongside the environmental report as part of the strategic environmental assessment. Presiding Officer, the committee also heard a wide range of evidence from witnesses citing examples from other countries where taxation on air travel has either been reduced or abolished. The committee welcomes the previous commitment from the Cabinet Secretary to provide further information on the experience of the Republic of Ireland and in particular the regional impacts within Ireland which resulted from the decision to abolish aviation tax. Presiding Officer, related to the issues of economic impact of the proposed 50% reduction in ADT was how the socio-economic and environmental outcomes of the proposed reduction would be monitored. I think it's fair to say there were a range of views on the committee with regard to the outcomes that may result from the proposed reduction. However, the committee was unanimous in recommending that the socio-economic and environmental outcomes arising from ADT should be regularly evaluated and reported upon to Parliament every second year. The Cabinet Secretary has indicated previously in evidence to the committee that the Scottish Government also thought it would be helpful to consider an evaluation of the outcomes arising from the proposed reduction in ADT. To this end, the committee recommended that the Scottish Government should bring forward amendments at Stage 2 to place a duty on ministers to this effect. In this regard, while I note the Scottish Government do not intend to bring forward amendments at Stage 2, I do however welcome the fact that the independent economic impact analysis will also include consideration of the best way to design a robust monitoring and evaluation framework to assess the socio-economic and environmental impacts of ADT. Lastly, the third matter which I wish to address is the issue of exemptions and the absence in the bill of the detail of the exemptions to ADT which the Scottish Government intends to apply. The Scottish Government has indicated that it intends to deal with the issue via secondary legislation. There were a range of views on the committee with regard to the most appropriate legislative route that should be taken to address this issue. However, the committee did recommend it, albeit by division, that the Scottish Government should bring forward the detail of the exemptions it intends to apply at stage 2. I therefore welcome the commitment the Cabinet Secretary has given that the Scottish Government will indeed bring forward amendments at stage 2, detailing the exemptions to definitions of chargeable passengers and chargeable aircraft that the Scottish Government intend to apply. I understand that it will not be possible to bring forward an amendment relating to passengers flying from all Highlands and Islands airports, as this will require to be notified to and assessed by the EU under the state aid rules. Presiding Officer, in closing, I want to put on record the committee's appreciation for the constructive engagement we've had with the Cabinet Secretaries and officials in supporting our scrutiny of the bill, and I welcome the commitments the Cabinet Secretary has made in his opening statement and in his letter of 21st April in response to the committee's report. Presiding Officer, in conclusion, the committee supports the general principles of the bill. Thank you.
I now call Murdo Fraser up to 7 minutes, please, Mr Fraser.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I start by echoing the thanks that the Finance and Constitution Committee convener has given to all those who give evidence to the committee, to the committee clerks and to SPICE for all their assistance in relation to the preparation of the Stage 1 report. And as we've heard, with a few notable exceptions, the deliberations of the committee on the issue were largely consensual. The background to this bill, as the convener has pointed out, is the devolution of air passenger duty to Scotland as part of the package of devolution being put through by the current UK Conservative Government in response to the Smith Commission report. This allows the Scottish Parliament to decide to take a different route in relation to the taxation of air travel, should it choose to do so. The bill before us simply creates a mechanism for the collection of a tax. Were this bill not to be implemented, then, as from next year, there would be no tax on air travel payable from airports in Scotland. It therefore makes sense to have legislation providing a framework to be put in place for the continued collection of a duty from air passengers. What this bill does is largely reflect the existing framework in place at the UK level for air passenger duty. Yes, indeed.
Patrick Harvey.
On the face of it, I don't disagree with the basic description that Mr Fraser has given, but can he recall any other situation in which a government has proposed legislation to create a tax which that government itself basically thinks ought not to exist?
Well, I thank Mr Harvey for his intervention. I appreciate Mr Harvey will be unhappy this afternoon. This bill, these proposals combine two things he likes least in the world. One of them is aviation and the other is tax cuts. And to put them together in one bill must be horrendous for poor Mr Harvey in the course of this particular afternoon. Of course, we haven't had much experience. To try and answer his point of the Scottish Government dealing with taxation, nothing would surprise me, frankly, about the Scottish Government's approach to taxation. But we'll learn more in due course. But if I could go back to what I was saying before I was interrupted, in terms of the framework of the tax, the evidence we heard from all the interested parties, and particularly the airline industry, who are, of course, responsible for the collection of the tax, is they don't want to see a completely different framework established for Scotland. What they want to see are the mechanisms currently in place being replicated as closely as possible. And therefore, there was no appetite that we detected on the committee in taking evidence for creating a wholly new tax on a different basis from the air passenger duty that currently exists. Indeed, the only substantial difference seems to be that the tax has been given a different name. It's been called air departure tax rather than air passenger duty, and cynics might suggest this is simply an exercise in changing the name for the sake of it, rather than a reflection of any different approach in practical terms. Now, the Scottish Conservatives are supportive in general terms of the bill, and will be happy to support the general principles at decision time tonight. There is one principal concern that we raised during Stage 1 that my colleague Adam Tompkins raised when we were taking evidence on a number of occasions. And this is reflected in the Stage 1 report. I'm going to make some progress if I can. I'll give way later if I have some more time. As Bruce Crawford pointed out, the bill does not stipulate the exemptions to the definitions of chargeable passenger or aircraft. In other words, it does not identify which category of passenger and aircraft will not be subject to the tax. As the report says, this is unusual in tax legislation, where the scope of taxation is provided for in primary enactments. This is different to the setting of rates and bans, which is normally left to secondary taxation. The equivalent legislation at a UK level is contained in the Finance Act 1994, where the exceptions to APD are set out, and is also reflective of the approach taken with other devolved taxes, such as lands and buildings transaction tax. And as we've heard, by a majority, the committee agreed that the Scottish Government should take forward amendments at stage 2 to insert detailed permission for exemptions from the definition of chargeable passenger and chargeable aircraft. And I am pleased that the Scottish Government have indicated that they accept this point and they will bring forward stage 2 amendments in this respect. Now, much of the evidence, Presiding Officer, that was taken by the committee addressed the policy intent of the Scottish Government to pursue a 50% reduction in air departure tax in order to stimulate economic growth. And this point is not covered in the bill itself, as the setting of rates and bans will be contained in subsequent legislation. What was clear from the evidence taken by the committee that there was a lack of an appropriate evidence base for the economic benefits of cutting ADT. Edinburgh Airport had themselves commissioned an economist's report showing economic advantage from reducing ADT, but beyond this, it's fair to say there was a lack of independent economic assessment. And all of those who gave evidence from whatever side of the argument agreed that such independent assessments would be welcomed. And the committee's recommendation was therefore that independent economic analysis of the proposed reduction in ADT should be published at the same time or ahead of the Scottish Government proposing its approach in relation to ADT tax rates and bans. And of course, the Scottish Government has accepted this point. And the committee had similar views in relation to the environmental impact of cutting ADT. And again, this is something that should be addressed by the Scottish Government, and they've accepted that point too. The Scottish Conservative view in ADT is that we would support an overall 50% reduction in ADT rates, but our preference would be to see this targeted on long-haul flights, where we believe the greater economic benefits would derive. Because the evidence shows that those travelling long-haul tend to stay in Scotland longer and have more money to spend. The economic benefit to Scotland would therefore be greater by encouraging the growth of long-haul flights. And moreover, by cutting long-haul, there would be the opportunity to attract more long-haul operators to base themselves in Scotland, avoiding the need for passengers to make connecting flights from Scotland to other hub airports such as Heathrow or Schiphol, which in itself might prove an environmental benefit. And the committee heard evidence that whilst reducing ADT on domestic or short-haul flights might well have a negative environmental impact by encouraging more of a shift away from surface travel towards air, the same would not necessarily apply to long-haul flights. So, for example, Virgin Trains, in their evidence, told the committee of their concern that cross-border rail journeys between Scotland and London, in particular, would be less competitive with air travel if domestic air ADT were to be reduced. But Virgin Trains were not opposed to reduction in long-haul ADT. Indeed, they believe that encouraging more visitors to the UK through such a move would be complementary to the expansion of rail travel within the UK. So I believe that both for economic and environmental reasons, a cut in long-haul, as opposed to a cut across the board, would make sense. But we do accept the need for a stronger evidence base, and we look forward to seeing the Scottish Government bringing forward that evidence when it sets out its own case for rates and bans in due course. Thank you.
Neil Bibby, up to 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Every party represented in the Parliament today is a signatory to the Smith Agreement, and has been mentioned by all the previous speakers. As part of that agreement, a commitment was given, supported by all parties, to devolve to this Parliament power over taxing the carriage of passengers from Scottish airports. That commitment should be honoured, and it's for that reason that Scottish Labour will vote to allow the bill to progress beyond stage 1 today. The bill, as has been said, is an enabling bill supported in principle by the Finance and Constitution Committee. It is a bill that is required if we as a Parliament to give the Scottish Government the authority to switch on a new air departure tax where air passenger duty is switched off here in Scotland next year. For us, endorsing the bill at stage 1 therefore means endorsing the principle that the Scottish Government should levy its own air departure tax in line with the conclusions of the Smith Commission. It does not mean in any way endorsing the approach set out by the Scottish Government as to what rates and bands of air departure tax should be. Scottish Labour object to the SNP's plans to effectively cut air passenger duty in half and then phase the tax out entirely. And we will vote against cuts to ADT rates when the time comes. We support an air departure tax bill because we believe there should be an air departure tax. But we oppose a tax cut for the aviation industry because it is the wrong priority at the wrong time. Across Scotland, our schools and local services are facing hundreds of millions of pounds of cuts. At a time when we should be protecting the services people rely on and finding new ways to invest in our communities, it is absurd that this should be the SNP government's priority. And it's unacceptable that the Scottish Government cannot tell us now what the impact their proposals to cut this tax will be on the budget. Since 2011, this Government has cut £1.5 billion from schools and local services. I'll say that again, £1.5 billion. 117 million of which have fallen in Renfrewshire, where the Finance Secretary and I represent. Across Scotland, SNP cuts threaten schools, care services, road repairs and more. There are public sector workers who can't afford to make ends meet, and there are many local services that our councils cannot afford to sustain. Yet the SNP tell us that they can afford to make a business class flight cheaper. It's estimated that the value of this tax break could be as high as £189 million. The key question, as James Kelly posed earlier for the Finance Secretary, the key question for the Finance Secretary to answer is what will be cut to pay for this? The axe will have to fall somewhere. Will it be schools, hospitals, bus pass cuts for the elderly? It's time for the SNP to be honest about their plans. Or is it just going to be £189 million of unspecified cuts that we are set to see over the next few years? A 50% cut in APD will also not make Scotland any fairer. Analysis from the Office of National Statistics indicates that halving APD would save the top 20% of earners £73, while saving the poorest on average only £4.50. It's those on higher incomes who fly more often, and so it's those on higher incomes who would benefit the most from any cut. Nor will a 50% cut or the phasing out of air departure tax completely make Scotland any greener. The Scottish Government themselves accept this could lead to a 3% increase in aviation emissions, which could have a severe negative effect on our climate. Leaders of every party represented here today have signed up to the climate change agreement, committing us to building a low-carbon transport system for Scotland. Incentivising air travel at the expense of cross-border rail contributes nothing to the fight against climate change. The Finance Committee, as has been said, recommended that the Scottish Government should publish an analysis of the likely increase in carbon emissions arising from the proposed tax break. And the committee also recommended that amendments should be brought forward at stage 2, placing a duty on ministers to report on the socio-economic and environmental outcomes arising from air departure tax every second year. And we should go further, ensuring stronger safeguards are written into the bill at stage 2. Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government haven't presented us with a convincing case that a tax cut will make Scottish aviation any more competitive. They decided on what their policy is before considering the full facts and the arguments. They're only now commissioning the research to back up their claims. Changing the tax regime, but we can tell now that changing the tax regime won't in itself boost connectivity or improve our infrastructure. There was some discussion at the Finance Committee around the Irish experience of abolishing APD, because the Irish experience is interesting. The growth in passenger numbers often attributed to the tax cut there actually coincided with growth in passenger numbers right across Europe, including here in Scotland. It's not clear at all that tax cuts was actually a stimulus for growth. As Chris Day from Transform Scotland pointed out, it's noticeable that the upturn in flights at Dublin was in hand before Ireland abolished APD. Here in Scotland, Edinburgh Airport recorded an 11% increase in passenger numbers in 2016, despite existing APD regime being in place. And regularly we see motions from MSPs across the chamber welcoming new routes and record passenger numbers at their local airports, celebrating the success of Scottish airports, but at the same time undermining the Minister's case that an ADT cut is a necessity. Presiding Officer, there is no evidence that the Scottish Government's chosen approach to air departure tax will make Scotland any fairer, any greener or more economically resilient. In fact, next to no evidence has been produced in support of the Scottish Government's case at all. The Finance Committee has said unequivocally in the Stage 1 report, they say, and I quote, "There was considerable consensus across all spectrums of opinion that the evidence base underpinning the proposed reduction required development. The proposed reduction in ADT currently lacks an adequate evidence base." Finally, Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government say it is in their intention to listen and to consult before setting ADT rates and bans later this year. Yet we already know from the existing Scottish Government consultation that there is widespread opposition to their proposed tax cuts. If, following a consultation that Mr Mackay finds yet again there is opposition to an ADT cut, will the Finance Secretary abandon his plans for an airline tax giveaway? And we would welcome an answer to that question.
You must close, please, Mr.
Will he listen to the majority? It's not often the SNP do that. But anyway, we will support the introduction of an air departure tax today, but we will not support the proposals to cut that tax, which for months the Scottish Government has been unable to justify. Instead, let's use the powers of the Parliament to create a fair, proportionate and stable air departure tax regime.
We now move to the open debate, and we have absolutely no time in hand, so can I ask for some self-discipline from speakers, please? And we have Marie Todd, to be followed by Liam Kerr.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As of next year, the Scottish Parliament will set the tax rates on a new Scottish air departure tax. This will present the Government with an opportunity to design a tax around the needs of the Scottish economy and to boost international connectivity and to help generate sustainable growth. Our current level of air passenger duty, as the UK tax is known, is one of the highest of these taxes of this kind in the world, and it's the highest of its kind by far in Europe. Our Government stood on a manifesto commitment of reducing this tax, which would put Scottish airports on a more even footing with many other European airports, who hope to secure the same airlines and routes as our local airports do. I welcome the Scottish Government's commitment to helping our airports secure new international connections, and I hope that we will be successful in securing new links with Europe, new long-haul routes and good connections to world hubs. This will show that Scotland is open and ready to do business on an international stage. Many submissions to the committee claimed that an ADT reduction will lead to an increase in routes, capacity and passengers. Several airlines such as EasyJet and Ryanair have already confirmed this, as they're already making commitments to increase their presence in Scotland if such a reduction is implemented. That offers the prospect of a significant boost to our economy, helping businesses, creating jobs and boosting tourism, all of which should be welcomed. In my region, particularly in the islands, air travel is not a luxury, it's a necessity for businesses and for communities. It's often the simplest and most practical way of getting where you need to be. For many folk in the islands, air travel is essential for both people's professional and private lives. Many people who fly to and from the islands from other parts of Scotland do so out of necessity rather than choice. In evidence given to us at committee, they said that 1 in 4 passengers who travel on routes from Glasgow and Edinburgh and Aberdeen to the Highlands and Islands are funded directly by a public service such as councils or the NHS, which funds patients and staff who need to travel. When I worked for the NHS, I regularly had to fly from Inverness simply to be able to do my job. Choosing to fly is the difference between 1 day off work and 3 days off work for an education session in London. Loganair alone carry about 500,000 passengers a year on routes that are exclusively in Scotland. And all bar one of those routes crosses a body of water. So on many of these routes, trains will not be a viable travel option. And all other alternatives will often be significantly more time-consuming and impractical than flying. Even from an environmental perspective, in particular on those routes where trains are not an option, for example, travelling between Edinburgh and Lerwick, to travel by car and ferry could generate more in emissions than a direct air journey. Clearly then, it's important for the local economy, that the current exemption for flights to the Highlands and Islands which depart from Glasgow, which depart from the Highlands and Islands under APD are continued in the new tax. The exemption ensures that there's no added expense for this essential travel, and I'm really pleased to see that the Scottish Government supports this in principle and hopes to implement it so long as it complies with state aid law, as any exemption of this sort rightly should. There's an obvious concern that a reduction in air departure tax would lead to an increase in aviation admissions due to the additional number of routes and flights operating in Scotland. And I welcome the prospect of additional investment and economic activity as a result of this reduction. But as someone who's committed to addressing climate change, I'd be concerned by any suggestion of a significant increase in admissions. So I'm comforted by the fact that the Committee on Climate Change has found that any increase in emissions as a result of this change is likely to be manageable. And the Government's ADT consultation paper estimated that a 50% reduction in tax would lead to a maximum increase in aviation emissions of around 3%, which would be an increase of only 0.1% of total Scottish emissions. Yes, I will.
Patrick Harvie.
I'm grateful to the member for giving way, and while I don't dispute the figures, all of us have a responsibility, including all industries, to make a serious contribution to reduced emissions. Is there any other industry that the member would like to give a free pass to?
Marie Todd.
No, is the short answer. I don't think it's giving a free pass to the air industry. I think the benefits of this policy, I think you have to look at the policy in the round and you have to look at the dealing with the emissions in the round as well. It's important for us to recognise that this increase wouldn't be significant enough to affect the Government's intention to reduce overall transport emissions by a third between 2014 and 2030. I welcome that ambition, and I'm really glad that a reduction in air departure tax wouldn't affect that target. The Government's given both the environmental impact of this policy and its financial implications thorough consideration thus far, and have given assurances that they'll continue to do so as this policy moves forward. As a newly devolved tax, this will be the first time that this Parliament's been able to make changes to this particular area of taxation, and it's absolutely vital that we consider any potential changes from all relevant angles before they are implemented.
May I have Liam Kerr to be followed by Willie Coffey, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. When travelling down on Sunday, I was thinking, what can I say about the Air Departure Tax Scotland Bill at Stage 1? But then I thought, as is often the problem when following Murdo Fraser, what more is there to say? For the bill simply introduces an air departure tax at the same time as the current APD will be switched off. It simply creates a mechanism for the collection of a tax. So, do the Scottish Conservatives support the general principles of the Air Departure Tax Scotland Bill at Stage 1? Well, yes. However, there is more to say, because where there is more to say is in what the bill doesn't say. Last May, in their manifesto, the SNP said of air passenger duty, quote, "When the power to do so is devolved, we will reduce the overall burden of APD by 50%, with the reduction beginning in April 2018, delivered in full by the end of the next Parliament." The Finance Secretary is on record as believing that cutting air passenger duty will boost growth. And when announcing the policy, Derek Mackay said that the proposed 50% cut is a fundamental component of our efforts to boost Scotland's economy through generating sustainable growth. Now, I spoke in the Scotland's economy debate the other week and said that we need a roadmap, a plan to revitalise our economy in Scotland. And it is always dangerous to assume anything in politics. But one thing and I think the rest of the committee were pretty hopeful of, was that the government and the SNP, when setting that manifesto, must have had sufficient evidence to make such a bold assertion about the impact of this policy. But when the Finance Secretary appeared before the committee on the 1st of March, the convener asked if the government had itself undertaken any economic assessment of the impact of a 50% cut in ADT. The answer from the Finance Secretary was instructive. He said, "To the best of my knowledge, we have not commissioned any independent research of our own, but we have certainly looked at all the reports that have been provided, and we have also looked at the experience in Ireland." And then we got a letter dated 21st of April in which the Scottish Government stated that it has now commenced the commissioning of an independent economic analysis of the 50% reduction plans to report in the autumn, at the point when the Government sets out the tax bands. Good. But, Deputy Presiding Officer, this isn't good enough. This bill, in its totality, is a major piece of legislation. It is potentially a major change to the airline industry, airports, possibly the economy, possibly the environment, and the macroeconomic UK picture. We think Derek Mackay is probably right that a reduction on ADT, properly targeted, will boost Scotland's economy. But isn't it deeply troubling that, firstly, to date, the Scottish Government has done no assessment, commissioned no independent economic analysis of its own to assess the economic or the environmental impact of the plan? And secondly, based its plans on those reports that have been provided to it, whilst also extrapolating principally from a country that, in many respects, is completely different to the Scottish situation. Yes.
Andy Whiteman.
Thank the member for giving way. The member says that the Scottish Government hasn't done any economic analysis of its plans. What economic analysis has the member done of his plans?
Liam Kerr.
I think Andy Whiteman actually makes my point for me. We've asked the government to bring forward its plans. It has set a manifesto commitment. We've looked at the extensive evidence that was provided to the committee and looked through it, but we're not putting the policy forward. And there is something else that I want to address here, because currently, as Marie Todd points out, there is an air passenger duty exemption for passengers flying from Highlands and Islands airports. Derek Mackay, in his speech, talked of, as a principle, the Scottish Government strongly supporting retaining a like-for-like exemption, and indeed wants to extend it. Because he's concluded that the removal of APD from air passenger transport in Highlands and Islands is a good way to support the area economically. Now, we had David Horn from Virgin Trains come in, and he warned the committee of his various concerns about modal shift if you start doing things with air passenger duty. And the Scottish Government does need to be careful of modal shift in the central belt, where the train is an unrealistic alternative or not the right means of transport for a local economy, such as in the North East or in the Highlands, as Marie talks about. Oughtn't we to encourage flying, as they are trying to do in the Highlands and Islands? Because the fact is that many of my constituents in the North East have little option but to fly if they need to make journeys to London or the Midlands. And Aberdeen Airport has suffered badly through the oil downturn, with passenger numbers only now recovering following 2 years of month-on-month decline. But when I asked in committee why an exemption couldn't be considered for Aberdeen Airport in the same way as it is for the Highlands, Mr Mackay told us it wouldn't happen and wouldn't even be considered. His view was that the best way to achieve the strategic objectives of boosting air connectivity and generating sustainable economic growth is to apply ADT equally to all areas and airports. And a differentiated approach is likely to increase complexity, administration, and difficulties in compliance. But these propositions clearly do not marry, and I find it deeply concerning that the government will dismiss one proposition without investigation simply for expediency and apparent ease, whilst pursuing a differentiated policy fraught with complexity and EU red tape simply because that's the way it's always been, and an assumption that is the way it should stay. Deputy Presiding Officer, I said at the outset that the Scottish Conservatives were backing the bill before us today, and it's clear why. There really isn't much of substance in the bill to oppose. But what is much more interesting, which of course I use as a euphemism for concerning, is what is not included, what has been assumed, what has been decided without independent investigation. Thank you.
May I have Willie Coffey to be followed by Neil Findlay.
Thanks very much, Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to be able to speak in the debate in support of the Government's proposals to reduce and then eliminate the air passenger duty, the tax imposed by the UK Government on people every time they fly. The UK imposes the highest taxes than anywhere else in Europe. In fact, more than 3 times the rate that France applies and around double what Germany and Italy charges their citizens. Since the tax was introduced in 1993 by the Tory government at the time, the tax rate for long-haul trips for the lowest class of travel has increased by a spectacular 630% and raises about £3 billion a year. So when Scotland reduces the tax from as early as April next year, it will place us in a much more competitive position and will mean that our version of this tax will be much lower than it is in England and Wales. In fact, give me a wee minute to develop a point here, if you don't mind. In fact, England and Wales would remain the most expensive for Band B economy flights, while Scotland would drop to 9th in that category. The boost that cutting this tax initially by 50% could bring to Scotland will be significant. It helps us achieve a more level playing field with the other European airports, and the shift to Scotland of many of these flights would make a significant economic impact for us too. I'm happy to take James Kelly's intervention.
James Kelly.
I thank Mr Coffey for taking the intervention. You're outlining all the money that's going to be saved in tax. £189 million a year is going to be taken from the Scottish Government budget. What areas are going to be cut to find that additional revenue?
Willie Coffey.
Thanks for raising that, Mr Kelly. What Labour seems to be completely overlooking and forgetting is the economic impact that this will have. And when I come to Prestwick Airport, I would hope that Labour and Mr Kelly would support the investment and the growth in jobs that it could bring to the Ayrshire economy. It perhaps explains to Mr Kelly and Labour why they've got no MPs and no MSPs in that county or this part of Scotland. If I could continue, EasyJet has said that it will increase capacity in Scotland to accommodate an extra 1.5 million passengers. And Ryanair, on top of its 17 new routes, has said it will add a further 1 million passengers when the 50% cut takes place. The impact in abolishing air travel tax in Ireland has been significant, and not just for the city of Dublin. Since their tax was abolished in 2014, Dublin has seen the highest rate of passenger growth in Europe, with year-on-year rises of about 15%. As a direct response to abolishing the travel tax in Ireland, Ryanair introduced 25 new routes and guaranteed an extra 1.2 million passengers each year. Now, Dublin handles about 28 million passengers per year, compared to Edinburgh, around 12 million, and Glasgow at 9 million. But the regional airports in Ireland have benefited too, with increased frequencies serving Cork, Shannon and Donegal. Dublin's managing director said that the growth in passenger numbers has had a significant impact on the whole Irish economy, with higher visitor numbers and increased trade and investment coming in. And according to Airlines UK, when Netherlands abolished its aviation tax in 2010, we saw an increase of 20 million departing from Dutch airports. The Edinburgh Airport study here suggested that by 2020, this policy will create nearly 4,000 new jobs and bring about £200 million extra to the Scottish economy. But, Presiding Officer, it's not just Edinburgh and Glasgow who would benefit from the cut in this tax in Scotland. Prestwick in Ayrshire stands to benefit from the tax reduction, as have the Irish regional airports. In 2014, at a meeting of the British-Irish Parliamentary Assembly, which I attended, Ryanair's Michael O'Leary said that if Scotland was to abolish what he described as a mindlessly stupid policy, then he could double passenger numbers at Prestwick alone. And only a few weeks ago, Ryanair said that the scrapping of this tax will enable Ryanair to base more aircraft in Scotland, add more routes and create thousands of additional jobs. A huge opportunity indeed for Prestwick and the wider Scottish economy. Prestwick currently contributes about £60 million a year to the Scottish economy, and is well placed, as members will know, to become the front runner in the site selection to become the UK's first spaceport, due to its existing facilities, infrastructure and meteorological conditions. It would be welcome, therefore, Presiding Officer, if all parties in Ayrshire got behind Prestwick Airport and distanced themselves from comments made by an Ayrshire Tory councillor who said that Prestwick Airport should shut. In terms of our committee's examination of the government's proposals, 11 of our 12 members supported the general principles, while asking the Scottish Government to provide more analysis of the economic and environmental impacts of the policy. I'm pleased to note that the economic assessment that all members did seek will be carried out and published no later than the autumn of this year, as the Cabinet Secretary said in his opening speech. On the emissions issue, I expect other colleagues will want to focus in on this a bit more closely, but we did hear that the policy could give rise to an increase of 3% in greenhouse gas emissions, representing around 0.1% in the total Scottish emissions, which was described as manageable by the UK Committee on Climate Change. Presiding Officer, the economic opportunities that the policy brings to Scotland and to Prestwick Airport in particular are immense. The Irish experience is that for every additional 1 million passengers they have achieved, they've managed to create an extra 1,000 jobs. This will be a fantastic boost for Scotland and for Prestwick, and I'm delighted to back the Scottish Government's proposals to reduce and then get rid of this travel tax. Thank you.
Neil Findlay, to be followed by Patrick Harvey.
Thanks very much, Presiding Officer. There are many competing priorities for any government. There are so many areas of our society that need urgent attention of both government and this Parliament. The public services that civilise our society are under huge pressure, with many at breaking point. Whether it's the school system that educates our children, the care service that looks after our elderly and vulnerable citizens, or the police who keep our streets safe, they're all under pressure like never before. And these areas should be the priority for this government and this Parliament. But clearly they're not. The First Minister says her priority is education and closing the education attainment gap, yet she cuts the budgets of councils and colleges year on year on year. The Government has overseen the loss of 130,000 college places, cuts lecturing staff and failed to implement national bargaining. And we're going to see strike action. All of this driven by over 200 million cuts to the budget. So where is the bill or legislation to address these issues? What about our local services? 1.8 billion has been cut from council budgets since 2010. That's a 16% cut to our local communities, social services, schools and environment. No legislation, no bill to address these issues. Certainly if you want to explain
Marie
that.
Todd.
Can I ask the member if he welcomes the commitments already made by commercial airlines to bring more business to Scotland as a result of the policy?
Neil
If
Finlay.
Marie Todd listens, I'll move on to that point in a minute. But the point I was making is that all of those issues I've raised are down to the political choices made
Excuse me, Mr Finlay, could you move on to address the motion that
That's what I'm just
is
commenting,
under
Presiding
discussion,
Officer.
please?
All down to the political choices made by this government. Because what I would have expected is bills to address that. But what have been the bills brought forward? There have been a bill on independence, surprise, surprise, and then a bill on air passenger duty. Yes, with a plan to set up a system and bureaucracy to administer it, but behind it, a plan to cut it, then eradicate it completely. That's the plan. And we're in a period where our public services are crying out for investment, where cuts are crippling services and jobs are being lost by the tens of thousands. And what is the action of this government? Is it to take a progressive position, raising money from those who can afford it to pay for services to help those in need? Or is it to address the crises in these public services? No, it's to rip another 200 to 300 million of scarce revenue from those services, whilst handing a £73 at minimum tax cut a year to the wealthiest people and a £4.50 tax cut to the least wealthy. On which planet is that progressive or fair? I will give way to the Finance Secretary if he wants to tell us how the policy he promotes is progressive. There you go, glued to his chair. The Finance Secretary can't answer that because he knows it's not. Oh, well, here's Merlin going to tell us how it's progressive.
Derek Mackay.
I think it says a lot that the member has to invite you by making some sort of insult. I would simply say to Neil Finlay, does Neil Finlay not care for the employees of, for example, Edinburgh Airport, who are trying to make an economic success of that, which is part of our connectivity, our economic success story, and ensuring that we continue to grow our economy in a way that's good for everyone, not least those who happen to be employees of airports and airlines?
Neil
Mr.
Finlay.
Mackay defeats his own argument because Edinburgh Airport is hugely successful without this cut. But you don't champion the public services that are crying out for the investment that's going to disappear. No mention of that, Mr. Mackay. And you've still to tell us where the cuts will land. On which planet is the 50,000, 60,000, whatever it is, extra tonnes of greenhouse gases pumped into the atmosphere consistent with the government's stated environmental policies? Again, there appears to be some magic trick going to be done where we have all of these increased flights and yet there will be no impact on the environment. 13% of greenhouse gases come from travel, and the government's own analysis shows that there's an effect. The effect of the cut will be to increase air travel and the associated emissions by more than 50,000 tonnes. So, the Minister can't explain how this is progressive, and he most certainly can't explain how this is good for the environment. If we go back to why APD was introduced, it was because the aviation industry was heavily undertaxed, not subject to VAT, and yet this government wants to give more tax giveaways for the industry. I'm firmly, absolutely firmly of the belief that this government is completely in the grip of the aviation sector. There is no evidence that a cut in APD is beneficial to the economy. There may indeed, some have suggested, be a loss of income from domestic tourism, and there's no evidence to support this cut. This is a government that claims to implement evidence-based policy.
You must come to a close, Mr Finlay.
Yet the Finance Minister is throwing away £230 million on a wing and a prayer. Is it any surprise that Murdo Fraser and the Tories support it on a day that they want to rip tax credits from rape victims? They want to give a big tax cut to the aviation industry. Shame on you.
Can I remind members that they should always speak through the chair and not to each other? And can I have Patrick Harvey to be followed by Mike Rumbles?
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I begin by echoing the thanks of Bruce Crawford to our committee colleagues, the clerking team and support staff, and to the witnesses during the Stage 1 inquiry. Now, I didn't really expect to like this bill. I should imagine that the Cabinet Secretary didn't really expect me to like this bill either. A few things have surprised me during the process. One surprise, the additional delicious irony of debating this bill at Stage 1 just before a debate on Earth Hour, where everyone will pat themselves on the back about the lovely little symbolic gestures that we're making. I've even seen press releases over the last month from airline companies saying how great they are because they switched the lights off in their corporate headquarters for an hour for the planet. Aren't they good? No, they're hypocrites. And so is anyone else who takes that kind of stance. I was also surprised, in a way, that the bill is so close to being one that I could support. And I think that confusion at the heart of the government's policy intention is the reason for that. I think normally when we see a government bill, you would see a policy memorandum that says what the objective, what the purpose of the legislation is. But the only purpose of the legislation in the strategic objectives, paragraphs 8 and onwards in the policy memorandum, those purposes would be served by not passing this bill, by having no tax on aviation at all. If the purposes, the strategic objectives that the government sets are what it really cares about, it wouldn't pass this bill at all. It wouldn't even propose it. This is a tax being legislated by a government which thinks that tax ought not to exist. And so it's understandable that we see a bill that is bereft of meaning, of intent, of purpose. I think there is good purpose in taxing aviation differently than other forms of economic activity because it has disproportionate impacts on the environment and in terms of social inequality, and we need to mitigate those forms of impact. We need to manage those forms of impact in a way that's consistent with economic objectives, but tax is an important means of achieving that. And a bill which was very clear that that is the purpose of an aviation tax would be somewhat different. Perhaps not radically different. It would not give a free hand to ministers simply to say, we'll come back to you and let you know what the rates and bands are going to be, and then you as Parliament will nod them through, Deputy Presiding Officer. We won't have the ability to amend those proposals when they come forward. We'll either nod them through or we'll be told that we're giving the aviation industry an even freer gift, an even bigger free gift by way of not taxing them at all. A bill that I could support would constrain ministers somewhat to at least consider the factors that are important. Let's look at the economic factors. The government and backbenchers, including some in the debate today, has said there will clearly be a really positive economic boost for Scotland from this. Evidence? Evidence we have seen none. I think Mr Kerr, in his speech, recognised the fact that the government say, to the best of the Cabinet Secretary's knowledge, they've conducted no economic analysis of their own. And he referred the committee to some pre-existing reports. Reports which are based on outdated information about the labour market, unreliable information about the fiscal impacts of this policy from the government, reports that simply cannot be depended upon as evidence, and in fact some of which have come into the public domain after the SNP adopted its policy, not before. We should be making policy on the basis of the evidence, not scrounging around to see if we can work up some policy after, some evidence after we've adopted the policy. The economic impacts are entirely unclear, and the government should be undertaking that analysis prior to adopting a tax policy. The environmental impacts have been spoken about, and I think Marie Todd was the first to talk about the limited increase. It's only going to be a small percentage increase from our aviation emissions as a result of the government's policy. Well, as far back as 2009, the UK Climate Change Committee was saying not that we need to limit the increases, but that we need to restrict aviation emissions. In fact, that by 2050, they need to be held back to 1990 levels. We need to be seeing reductions in emissions, not just modest increases. Even the industry, in fact, in giving evidence to the committee, said not only that they could achieve that restriction back to 1990 levels, they're saying that a 50% reduction by 2050 relative to 2005 levels. A 50% reduction relative to 2005 levels, an even more ambitious goal. Now, I don't take for a moment seriously the suggestion that they're doing what it would take to achieve that, but if they think they can, we should lock them into it. And we should say to the Minister, he has to ensure that the tax rates are compatible with achieving that. And in terms of social justice, the figures that the Scottish Greens have published today demonstrate that of the 89 million plus that would be saved from just UK leisure passengers alone, 33 million of that will go to the richest 10% of households, 60 million to the richest 30% of households, and just 8 million to the poorest 10% of households. So all of these issues, economic, environmental, fiscal and social, should be written, hardwired into the bill. Greens will move amendments to do that. If those amendments pass, then we could support the bill at stage 3, otherwise we'll oppose it. Tonight we will abstain on the basis that this bill is fixable, and will make every effort to persuade the government that it needs to be fixed.
Can I give notice to the closing speakers, please? I'm going to have to shave some time off you, and I call Mike Rumbles, to be followed by Kate Forbes.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. On the 7th of October last year, the First Minister said that the Scottish Government is committed to acting on climate change and limiting global temperature increases to below 1.5 degrees. The SNP website, and I have been reading it, says we hope our example can embolden the international community. And on her recent self-publicity tour of the United States, Nicola Sturgeon added, and I quote, "We're not complacent about climate change and there is still much to achieve." Well, she hasn't really been listening to her own SNP MSPs during this debate, has she? Analysis by Transport Scotland has concluded that cutting air passenger duty by 50%, which is what the SNP intend to do, will lead to an increase in emissions of carbon dioxide by up to 60,000 tonnes a year. Yes, 60,000 tonnes a year. And that figure has hardly been mentioned in this debate. Where are all our environmentalists? Aren't we all supposed to be environmentalists now? What is the government's response? The SNP reaction is to say, well, we can offset this huge increase in emissions by making other changes in the transport sector. Oh, really? If that's the aim of the government, I wouldn't put too much faith in the Transport Minister to deliver this offsetting, especially when he appeared in front of the committee when he said they he simply accepts Transport Scotland's other prediction of increasing car use in Scotland by 27% within the next 13 years, and failing to come up with any real ideas on how to combat this. And if you've got an idea that you could mention to the Transport Minister, I'm sure he would be delighted to hear it, but I would like to hear it too.
Through the chair, Mr Rumbles, Marie Todd.
Thank you. In the interest of accuracy, I would like to challenge the word huge increase, in that it's only a 0.1% increase of total emissions.
Mike Rumbles.
There we have it. There we have it. The SNP believe that an increase of 60,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide, an increase, is minor. I'm afraid any reading of the situation, I'm glad to see the Transport Minister's back in his seat. Like so many policy areas, the SNP government have no interest in doing what is right, only doing what is politically expedient to their cause. Air travel is the highest emitter of carbon dioxide per passenger kilometre. It's the only sector where emissions have risen significantly during the last 2 decades. Yes, they've risen. And the SNP actually want to add to this increase by cutting tax on air travel. SNP members, rather than apologising for them, should be asking their ministerial colleagues how pumping this extra 60,000 tonnes of carbon into Scotland's environment and losing at least £125 million of revenue each year will help the Scottish Government build a sustainable legacy for our children. Scotland's aviation sector is in good health. It's flourishing, with passenger numbers growing by 5 million in the past 5 years. And on a personal level, I'm delighted. My son is an airline pilot in Scotland. It's great news. So I do know a little bit about the aviation industry. But there is no good reason to give aviation a free pass. We need everyone to meet their carbon reduction responsibilities and pay their fair share. As MSPs, we get many approaches from lobbyists, giving us their view, and this subject is no different. I was particularly taken by the response of the Church of Scotland to this debate, and I read their comments with great care. I'll highlight them. The Church of Scotland is disappointed by these proposals on 3 grounds. 1, we believe they are inconsistent with Scottish Government commitments to reduce Scotland's greenhouse gas emissions. 2, they promote inequality. Those on high incomes fly most and will benefit most. People like me, people like us. While those living in poverty fly least and will benefit least, if at all. 3, they put pressure on the UK government to follow suit. No, not only is it simply the wrong thing to do to tackle climate change, it leaves at least 125 million a year hole in the public finances. A hole which needs to be filled. Either the Scottish Government will need to raise these taxes another way, and where will that burden fall? Or it will have to reduce expenditure and cut budgets. And where will these budget cuts fall? Finally, for those who say that this vote is simply an enabling vote, and I've heard that too, to allow this tax to be levied in Scotland, just look at Part 3 of the bill. A whole section on tax rates without any mention of what those tax rates should be. Where is the policy memorandum? It doesn't exist. It simply says in Section 10, subsection 3b, regulations under this section may modify this Act. In layman's terms, if we pass this bill, then Scottish ministers may change what they like in it. No, presiding officer, this is a terrible bill which gives too much power to ministers and not enough power to this Parliament, and deserves to be thrown out. I'm with the Church of Scotland on this one, and the Liberal Democrats will be voting against this bill at decision time.
I call Kate Forbes to be followed by Rachel Hamilton.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I'll start by saying that I'm the PLO to the Cabinet Secretary. Presiding Officer, the Government's motion asks the Parliament to agree to the general principles of the air departure tax, with the detail coming later. I, of course, generally support the devolution of the tax, but I would like to set out quite broadly why I believe that the Scottish Government should take advantage of the devolution of this tax to bring air departure tax in line with international competition, for the benefit of residents and small businesses in my constituency and across Scotland. Now, the Highlands and Islands has benefited enormously from air travel exemptions, and they would benefit even more from a Scotland-wide reduction. In the Highlands and Islands, the challenges of connectivity are exacerbated, and yet our economy is dependent on movement of goods, import and export, and movement of people, tourists or entrepreneurs scoping out and developing business opportunities. And air travel is a necessary part of free movement. That's why I've welcomed more flights in and out of Inverness, why I strongly support reopening the airstrip in Skye for commercial flights, and why better connectivity goes right to the heart of population retention, of job creation, of growth and resilience in the economy. And it stands to reason that as a small island country of 5 million people, domestic and international travel and movement is critical. And so, if we are ambitious for economic growth, which I am, then we need new connections, more connections, attractive connections between Scotland and destinations around the world. But that is more challenging when air passenger duty in the UK is one of the highest taxes of its kind in the world, and by far the highest in Europe. And the international opportunities for businesses and jobs in my constituency are clear. Take the food and drink industry. There was a huge increase in the value of food and drink exports last year, as food exports alone grew by 22% to £1.5 billion. Fish and seafood, much of it caught by the fishermen on the, fish and seafood, much of it caught by the fishermen on the Highland West Coast, recorded the largest overall increase of a whopping £156 million.
Andy Whiteman.
Accept, however, that prawns and whisky will never pay air departure tax. And does she also agree that the simplest way of reaching the government's goals of eliminating this tax would be not to waste our time here by passing any bill and just let it fall?
Kate Forbes.
Sorry. What I do know that is in the Highlands and Islands we need more opportunities to be creating jobs in order to keep our young people, to keep families, to increase the income that is generated from these jobs. And so the growth in businesses, allowing entrepreneurs to take advantage of new opportunities, directly goes towards retaining our population. And that is certainly one of my priorities. So it's not done yet. Scotland's food and drink industry, sourcing much of its fine fare in the Highlands, is Scotland's fastest growing major sector with ambitions to grow further. And what's really important is that it's not just the big businesses, but the small and medium-sized businesses that are benefiting. But to capitalise on that, we need to internationalise more. In doubling food exports since 2007, we've also seen a transformation in growing markets like Asia. And the Chief Executive of Scotland Food and Drink has said that the game changer for food and drink over those years, and I quote, has been developing a national brand for Scottish produce in export markets, with industry and government working hand in hand to invest in overseas trade, exports and activity. And this success story has much further to go. Now, we know that smaller towns in rural Scotland are the most entrepreneurial in Scotland, places like Ullapool and Newton Moor, which topped the list, where 17% of the population are self-employed. And many of these small businesses are based on tourism or food and drink, which are dependent on travel and movement. Both sectors are doing well. Overseas visitor expenditure has risen 23% between 2005 and 2014. But how do these entrepreneurs, how do these small businesses grow and develop? Well, it's by building relationships, ideally face-to-face, with partners, investors and customers. And I appreciate that the Scottish Government is doing much to facilitate that. This month, the First Minister opened Scotland House in London, a platform for making connections and growing businesses. There's a wealth of opportunities out there in London, in Europe and beyond for Scottish businesses. That is the connection between Malig, between Carbos, between the Black Isle and overseas. But it doesn't matter how many opportunities are out there if we don't have good travel links. And that is why I believe that reducing air departure tax will make an enormous difference for travel to and from all Scottish airports and directly have a positive impact on families of the Highlands.
Rachel Hamilton, to be followed by Ivan McKee.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. It's almost taken a year, but finally we have before us stage one of a bill to debate in this Parliament. Finally, the powers that be have decided that focusing on issues other than a rerun of the same debate about Brexit is worthy of parliamentary time. This is a debate about air departure tax, and as the Chamber has heard, the Scottish Conservatives are supportive of this bill at this stage. The air departure tax will replace the current UK air passenger duty and will come into effect in 2018 if passed. As such, the Scottish Conservatives welcome Derek Mackay's commitment to amendments for Stage 2 to make detailed provision for exemptions from the definition of chargeable passenger and chargeable aircraft definitions that are currently not present, and as such, the bill does not even say which category or aircraft will not be subject to tax. Further, evidence on social, financial and environmental impacts is needed, and as the Finance Committee has highlighted, before MSPs are asked to set the band rates. The approach of the introduction of this bill that took almost a year was described as odd by Transform Scotland because without the full facts available about the nature of tax and the bans that apply to this bill, it is difficult to scrutinise. The Scottish Conservatives, however, want to see a more ambitious approach to the skies. Modo Fraser announced that we propose to remove the air travel tax on flights longer than 2,000 miles, and this will incentivise airlines to provide new direct links from Scotland to America, China and other global destinations, so families and businesses do not have to travel via London's packed airports. This is good for Scotland. It will promote Scotland as a visitor destination and as a business destination. Making Scotland easy to access makes it an easier place to do business and an easier place to get out and see our sights. All of this is part of our plan to get Scotland connected to the global economy. To put this into perspective on the uncompetitiveness of the current situation in the UK, the World Economic Forum's 2015 Globe Travel and Tourism Report lists the UK as 137th out of 140 countries in terms of ticket tax and airport charge competitiveness. It is therefore possible in this Parliament to open Scotland's doors wide, reap the rewards and see millions more passengers come to Scotland. To close, Presiding Officer, I and the Scottish Conservatives will support this bill at Stage 1. But at Stage 2, we hope to see amendments which make detailed provision for exemptions from the definition of chargeable passenger and chargeable aircraft. And of course, we want to see the removal of the air travel tax on flights longer than 2,000 miles and an immediate freeze on APD for short-haul flights to the UK and Europe. But what I want to see, and I'm sure others from opposition parties want to see, is a bill to come to this Parliament to be debated that can be fully scrutinised with the full information available to do so. It's taken almost a year for the first bill to come before us, and even in that time, we still don't have something that can be appropriately scrutinised, which, to use the words of Transport Scotland, is slightly odd. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you. I call on Ivan McKee, and then we'll move to closing speeches. Ivan McKee.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The transfer of air passenger taxes to the Scottish Parliament as part of the latest round of devolution gives Scotland the opportunity to design and implement a system of tax which will support our specific economic development needs. The UK-wide air passenger duty will cease to apply in Scotland from next April, and this bill is therefore necessary simply to put in place a replacement tax. The bill presented will only provide the structure for this tax, and the details of bands and rates will be proposed by the Government later this year and will be subject to parliamentary approval. However, the Government has also stated its policy objective to reduce the burden of ADT by 50%. So while rates and bands are not contained in the bill, the committee took evidence on the shape and structure of the proposed 50% reduction and the consequent economic and environmental impacts. Scotland is an international outward-looking nation, and our links to our European neighbours and to countries further afield are critically important to us. This is especially so in the context of the UK Government's headlong rush towards a hard Brexit which threatens those links. Scotland's place in the world depends on our international connectivity. Direct international flights are a key part of that connectivity, and steps to increase that connectivity should be encouraged to boost business, including inbound tourism, further develop cultural links and encourage free movement. It is important that the policy focuses, therefore, on the primary objective of enhancing economic growth, and I'm glad to see that this imperative is recognised by the Government. As the committee report states, the Scottish Government will design and structure ADT in a way that boosts Scotland's air connectivity and economic competitiveness, encouraging the establishment of new routes which will enhance business connectivity and tourism. The committee has highlighted the need for robust economic data,
which addresses the economic impact of any proposed rates and bans the Government will propose. And this is critically important to understanding the most effective way to use this tax lever to drive economic growth. Of course.
Patrick Harvey.
I'm grateful to the member. If the member is right and that economic analysis and data is the effective way to decide how to use the devolved tax, then why does the member think that the government has decided its policy of a 50% cut and then scrapping the tax so long before that data is available to it?
Ivan McKee.
Well, I don't think there's anything unusual about having a policy. Well, I've just asked, what did the Greens do a full economic analysis of their additional rate tax proposal, 60% I believe it was, which under any analysis would reduce the amount of tax take. Did you have an economic analysis of that? There's an intent to reduce by 50% the ADT, and as I said, as the committee said, robust economic analysis is essential to understanding the shape and how that would look. The ultimate objective must be to recover more than the tax loss through the cut from increased air activity and tax receipts from economic growth. We do, of course, need to recognise that any data can only be an estimated projection of what the economic outturn will be. Indeed, anyone who's been watching the committee's investigations into the relative changes to LBTT will understand the challenge in assessing economic impact of policy changes which have already taken place, never mind those still not implemented. Unpicking policy impacts from wider economic trends is not always easy, as is the assessment of our old friend, the counterfactual. Nevertheless, a thorough economic assessment in advance of changes to ADT policy, together with assessments of impacts on an ongoing basis, is required to give substance to the policy. I therefore welcome the Cabinet Secretary's commitment to return to Parliament with evidence regarding economic and environmental impacts of its approach to ADT prior to bringing forward specific proposals on rates and bans. The committee also recommends that the socio-economic and environmental outcomes arising from ADT should be regularly evaluated and reported upon every second year to Parliament. The most effective use of reductions in air departure tax as a mechanism to drive economic growth will come through understanding that a one-size-fits-all policy is too blunt an instrument to maximise that objective. While the committee held that simplicity of implementation and operation of the tax is a factor in the design of a future ADT system, it is also important not to lose sight of the primary objective and to deliver a reduction in that tax which recognises that reductions for some types of flights may deliver significantly more economic benefit than others. In other words, a differential approach. The committee heard about lifeline flights to communities in the Highlands and Islands where alternative transport solutions are limited, and the need to support those communities is well understood, and measures to ensure these flights are free from ADT should be a priority. Flights from the Central Belt to London and other large cities, however, compete with frequent fast rail routes, and there's an argument that ADT reductions in that context would do little to support the primary objective of maximising economic growth. Measures that encourage direct flights to European cities and beyond, on the other hand, can deliver significant benefits to our economy, in particular if targeted at locations where the scope for business and inbound tourism is greatest. The UK is one of the highest rates of air passenger taxes in the world, and this may make sense to maximise revenue from London airports where demand outstrips supply. But in this, as in many other UK government policies, what works for Scotland, for London and the South East is not always the best policy for Scotland, and we need to derive a policy for ADT that makes most sense in the Scottish economic context. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, I look forward to receiving the Government's economic analysis on its proposed rates and bans. I look forward to crunching the numbers and working through them in committee with the Cabinet Secretary and his officials. And I look forward to Scotland implementing an ADT policy that supports economic development and international links.
Thank you. We move to closing speeches. I call on James Kelly to wind up for the Labour Party.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'd like to start reiterating the comments from other colleagues in the debate, thanking the clerks on the Finance Committee and also SPICE for the excellent work they did in backing up the narrative that was produced in the Stage 1 report. In terms of the Labour Party's position in this debate, we will support the general principles of the bill as Neil Bibby outlined in his opening speech. Clearly, the air departure tax is a logical conclusion of the Smith Commission and the devolution of the replacement of APD. We support that tax. because it gives an additional lever to raise money from those who can afford air travel to contribute towards the Scottish budget. And we also support it from the point of view of seeking to reduce carbon emissions. So there's a logic in having that tax in place. However, the Scottish Government's reason for bringing this bill forward is to ultimately reduce the tax by 50% and ultimately abolish it. And it has to be said that in terms of supporting that policy, the evidence in this bill brought forward by the Cabinet Secretary, Derek Mackay, has been wholly inadequate. The policy memorandum clearly sets out that the objective is to reduce the effective ADT by 50% by the end of this Parliament. And as the financial memorandum sets out, by 2021-22, that would have the effect of reducing the impact on the Scottish, reducing revenue to the Scottish Government by £189 million. And we've not seen any analysis as to how that money that would be lost from the Scottish budget would be replaced. You know, Willie Coffey spoke about the economic benefits of this policy, but we've not seen anything from the government to back that up. When the Smith Commission set out the devolution of this tax, they also said that the environmental impact should be set out when it was going to be used, and that's something that has not been done in this bill. As Patrick Harvey pointed out, in terms of the submissions that we have seen that provide some analysis, mainly from the airport operators, those submissions are in some way dated and not up to date. For example, they were all done before Brexit, and they don't take any cognizance of the Brexit impact. So what we actually have is a situation where Derek Mackay has outlined today that he intends to bring Stage 3 forward before the end of the summer recess, and he's making it clear that any analysis would be later than that when the secondary legislation kicks in. So we're going to be asked before the summer to agree this bill and to agree the basis of the policy memorandum without any proper analysis or submission from the government. And that leaves us in a position where, as Neil Findlay correctly pointed out, you need to question the fairness of that policy, because as the ONS outlined, the top 20% of earners will be £73 better off, whereas the bottom 20% earners would only be £4.50 better off. That is not a progressive policy and is wholly unfair. And if you look at some of the other impacts of people travelling throughout Scotland, for example, a student when they turn 19 no longer has access to the Young Scot Rail card and has to pay a full season ticket fare, therefore incurring substantial travel costs, particularly if you are a student. Marie Todd made the point that airport travel in the Highlands was an absolute necessity. Well, if you're an apprentice staying in Cambuslang and you're earning less than the national living wage, but you require to travel to Cambuslang to reach your place of employment to successfully complete your apprenticeship, then that travel is absolutely essential. But bus travel from Cambuslang to East Kilbride and the substantial costs incurred heavily bites in to the wages that you earn if you're on less than the national living wage. So we need to ask the question how these priorities are going to be served, and also, as others have pointed out, how this lines up with a policy of seeking to reduce carbon emissions. I've heard minister after minister, not just in this chamber, but out at receptions and in media events, declare proudly about the world-leading climate change legislation that the Scottish Parliament has passed, and that's absolutely correct. But the logic of this policy is that you're going to increase air travel and therefore increase carbon emissions. So it seems to me that does, I'm sorry, but I'm running out of time. So it seems to me that it's not consistent with the Scottish Government's policy approach. So in summing up, Presiding Officer, I think the Government's policy approach to this has been incoherent and their submission of evidence to back it up has been inadequate. And I think it's time they thought again on this and brought forward more substantive evidence to back up their policy before we get to the stage 3 debate.
Thank you, and I call on Dean Lockhart to wind up for the Conservative Party.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Let me start by saying that it is welcome, if somewhat rare, opportunity to discuss draft legislation in this chamber. We've heard a range of different views on how this Parliament can use its powers in respect of air passenger duty or air departure tax, as it will be known going forward. While each party clearly has different views on the future of ADT, the debate today has centred around three main issues: concern about the lack of detail set out in the draft legislation, when and how do we get the details, the objectives of the government's proposals, what is the government trying to achieve, and the next steps required to take this legislation forward, and in particular the level of parliamentary scrutiny of any secondary legislation. Looking at stage 1 of the legislation, Liam Kerr, James Kelly and others have highlighted the fact the bill lacks detail in a number of important areas. It fails to set out the basis of liability for this new tax, which is a fundamental issue in any tax legislation. It also fails to identify which category of passengers or aircraft will be exempt from the tax. There are no details of the tax bands and the tax rates which will apply, and there has been, as we've heard, there has been no independent assessment of the economic, financial and environmental impact. As Rachel Hamilton highlighted, this lack of detail led the Delegated Powers and the Law Reform Committee to express its disappointment that this legislation has been introduced in the absence of full development of the government's policy. Given all of this, we would urge the Finance Secretary to undertake a full analysis of not just the economic and the environmental impact of this, but how it will work in practice, and avoid a repeat of the disastrous introduction of the Land and Buildings Transaction Tax, which has today been described as ill-suited by a study commissioned by the government itself. Turning to the objectives of the legislation, we support the overall direction of policy to reduce air departure tax. But if we are to proceed with a reduction, our preferred approach is to have a targeted reduction for long-haul flights, with the aim of increasing Scotland's global connectivity with major economic hubs in the US, China, India and Southeast Asia. This is where our approach differs from the less targeted proposal set out by Mr Mackay, who is advocating a blanket 50% cut to ADT, including for short-haul flights. Evidence given to the Finance Committee has shown that cutting ADT for short-haul flights would not necessarily deliver economic benefits. According to the Scottish Association for Public Transport, cutting ADT for short-haul flights would merely see growth of domestic flights at the expense of rail travel. So given all of this, we welcome the government's agreement to undertake a full independent economic, financial and environmental analysis of its plans, and we would urge this analysis to look at the following issues. First of all, the benefits of cutting ADT on long-haul flights compared to short-haul. Look at how this policy can help increase tourism from across the world. Scotland welcomes less than 50,000 tourists a year from China. This compares to over 1 million Chinese tourists visiting London alone. Average long-haul tourist spend in Scotland is over £650 per visit, which is significantly higher than the level of air departure tax per passenger, which would be foregone. So therefore, increasing tourism would be a welcome boost to the economy, but this analysis must show a link between reducing ADT and increasing tourism. As highlighted by Kate Forbes, we also need to look at how we can capitalise on more direct long-haul flights to increase our exports to the rest of the world, which have increased by 75% over the past 10 years. And finally, we need to look at how we can minimise the environmental impact of these proposals. Presiding Officer, other parties have expressed their outright opposition to any cuts to ADT. Labour's view, as summarised by Neil Bibby and others, is that this is a tax for those who can afford to fly, and it comes at the expense of other parts of public spending. But I think this looks at the wrong end of the equation. What we're suggesting here is, if targeted properly, a reduction in ADT will boost Scotland's global connectivity. I will in a second. Will boost Scotland's global connections, and if implemented properly, should result in a boost to the economy, encourage more people to do business in Scotland, with Scotland, to visit Scotland and to invest in Scotland. I'll give way.
Neil Bibby.
The SNP's proposed airline tax break will cost £189 million. Would the member tell us where those cuts will fall if he's supporting the SNP's position? The SNP haven't told us where the cuts are going to fall, £189 million. Will he tell us where the Tories will cut to fund this policy?
Thank you. Last year alone, tourism in the Scottish economy was worth almost £2 billion. So if we were to increase tourism by 5 or 10%, that would result in a much-needed boost to the Scottish economy. So we're not looking at cutting. We're not looking at... No, I need to make progress. We're not looking at cutting spending. We're looking at growing the economy and, in future, growing the Scottish Government's budget in years to come. We also heard from others about legitimate concerns surrounding the environmental impact of any reduction to ADT. To address these concerns, we agree a strict environmental impact analysis will be required, and we look forward to debating this when published by the Government. Let me conclude by highlighting to Mr Mackay what the next steps required to take this legislation forward. The Government has to produce supporting evidence of the economic, social, financial and environmental impact of their proposal. We need this evidence to be made available to this chamber before we debate the tax rates and the bans for ADT in the future. We would also suggest to the Government that before any reduction of ADT is made final, it works to reach agreement with the airlines for them to commit to expand their routes in response to any cut to ADT, as has happened in other countries. And finally, we need assurance from Mr Mackay that he will listen to this Parliament, to the Finance Committee and to the independent analysis before implementing these proposals and avoid a repeat of the disastrous implementation of the Land and Buildings Transaction Tax. Thank you.
Thank you, and I call on Derek Mackay to wind up the debate.
For how long, Presiding Officer? 2 minutes. Okay. Thank you, Presiding Officer. I heard the opposition demand for more time to continue this debate for those enthusiasts listening at home. Can I say, first of all, I thought it was actually a very consensual debate, and I really do mean that, because many suggestions have been made across the chamber that I'll reflect upon. And I hope that I've shown through the Finance and Constitution Committee's response that I have actually engaged with that committee, listened to the cross-party points of view and responded positively to a number of recommendations in good time for this stage 1 debate. And I don't want to lose any of the consensus that exists to support this bill, but it is interesting listening to Dean Lockhart lecture me, of course, about air departure tax and APD, because of course the Conservatives are converts to this principle around reduction in this tax. But hey, I won't be churlish on that point. I welcome, of course I welcome that position from the Conservatives. But things I thought I would never hear other members say. Mike Rumbles remains opposed to the legislation. That doesn't necessarily surprise me, although I will reflect on the fact that one of the requests for an extension of tax cuts for airlines is not least from his island counterparts who want to extend the air discount scheme to businesses and others, which I've had experience of as Transport Minister, and I understand that request, having increased it as Transport Minister. I welcome the position of the Labour Party. I will not take it as read that any support for the principles of the bill is in any way support for our proposition on the policy on tax rates and bans or other matters. But I agree with James Kelly and Neil Bibby, not words I often say, but I agree this is about the framework, the enabling legislation to allow the tax to be collected when the UK Government switches off the counterpart tax in April next year, of course.
Neil Bibby.
The key questions I think he's been asked by all Labour speakers today was to give us clarity on if there's £189 million of cuts, where would they fall in the event of him getting his tax breakthrough? Where are the £189 million of cuts is he going to choose to make should he get his tax cut through?
Cabinet Secretary set out the policy intent of a tax reduction to stimulate economic growth, improve connectivity, support tourism and sustain the routes that we already have, as well as secure new routes to Scotland, which can be achieved by Scotland having a level playing field and actually an advantage over other areas. But of course I'll engage with other parties as this legislation works its way through Parliament, and I have to engage with other parties to find compromise to ensure that the proposition around tax rates and bans is actually approved by Parliament. It was wrong for, if I can make some further progress, because there's a number of very important points I would like to make, that around this, it would be wrong to say that this is transferring power to ministers when ultimately Parliament will have to approve the tax rates and bans and indeed exemptions that will apply in Scotland. And that's why I've reflected on some of the changes that I'll bring forward at stage 2 to cover those points around, for example, the monitoring and evaluation impact report, exemptions, and indeed on the independent economic analysis. Now, this government's not alone in believing that a tax reduction would stimulate economic growth. I could cite the Scottish Chambers of Commerce or CBI Scotland as well. But the point really is this. This is about the principles, this is about the enabling framework to be able to collect the tax, and other matters will be determined at committee through affirmative procedure, and not least the issue around exemptions. I know how important the Highlands and Islands exemption is, and that's why I'm working now with the UK Government to ensure that we can have that continuity of like-for-like exemption for that area, and ensuring that, of course, it is compliant. But on the point around independent economic analysis, I think it should be welcomed that the government is embarking, taking forward, yes, our policy aspirations, the evidence we've seen from elsewhere, but I think a valid point was made around, some people might say, looking at the scrutiny or looking cynically at who's paid for some of the evidence. The point about our independent analysis is to arrive at an evidence-based decision, looking at it methodically, having looked at the modelling, what exists, and we know that having commissioned that evidence, we'll be in a good place to make the right decisions for that tax in Scotland, in keeping with our policy intent as we approach the switch off of this tax next April. Having heard the positioning of different political parties, this is about the successful transfer of this power. It is about devolution and delivering up to that deal which was achieved, and that's why I think the Liberals would be wrong to oppose it at this stage, because it is about the transfer of power, but also in embarking on the decision-making as we will, in a timely fashion that we do it, to deliver efficiency, certainty and clarity in the tax rates and exemptions going forward. And I suppose it is Patrick Harvie that surprised me most by saying he believes it could be made a better bill, and in his words, that it is fixable, recognising the opposition that the Greens have to the policy intent, but also that the Greens would like the tax to be collected in Scotland, and that's why I think that the principles are worthy of support. But there will be further engagement around the tax rates and bans.
I'm grateful to the member for giving way. I set out some of the principles that I think should be behind a bill like this. Principles of ensuring that ministers have to give due consideration to social, economic, fiscal and environmental factors in setting their tax policy. Is there any reason why the Cabinet Secretary would be anxious or uncomfortable with having to place due consideration to those factors before it comes back to Parliament? What would be the objection to such amendments that put principle into this bill?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I've been able to outline to the committee a positive response to a number of suggestions that have been raised by the Finance and Constitution Committee, and one of those is around the ongoing analysis and monitoring impact of our policy. So, of course, we'll take a close look at the impact of the decisions that we make as a government and as a parliament, and we have been balancing issues around affordability, economic growth, environmental impact, and we've been able to cover some of that, and we'll also be informed by further environmental analysis, including the strategic environmental assessment that will inform decisions around air departure tax. So I think we have to look at this in a balanced fashion, continue to engage with political parties, recognising that this is a transfer of power, we want it to be successful, and we also want to use this tax in a way that both stimulates the economy, supports connectivity, and particularly in light of some of the economic challenges and the situation coming from Brexit, to use this in a way that supports the economy, whilst also addressing the environmental concerns that have quite legitimately being raised, whilst looking at the wider transport envelope as well. And a number of members have focused on the environmental concern. Of course, this government is delivering on our environmental targets, and will set out further actions through our climate change efforts as well. And this government's record is a very strong one in delivering ambitious climate change targets. I'm almost ready to conclude, but I thank Mike Rumbles for his offer to intervene to further oppose the bill, which seems to have consensus across the chamber, and there will be further engagement through stage 2 and stage 3 as to how we take it forward. And of course, I listened very closely to what the Conservatives and others had to say around sharing some of the further evidence and analysis, and good time to be able to inform the decisions around rates and bans, of course addressing the exemptions issue in the way that I've outlined. And a number of members have said this is the first piece of legislation that the Parliament has considered. That's not the case. It might be a surprise to members, but we actually approved a budget bill which had various stages to become law and is delivering hundreds of millions of pounds of extra investment in the public services of Scotland. But I look forward to engaging with all members to take this legislation forward, following this very consensual debate, to ensure that we deliver this tax in a way that is competent, that's clear, that's in keeping with the Adam Smith principles, and follows on from the successful currently devolved taxes such as land and building transaction tax and the landfill tax, to ensure that it does support the economy and deliver on the policy objectives as outlined. And I therefore invite the Parliament to approve the general principles of the Air Departure Tax Scotland Bill.
Thank you very much. The next item of business is consideration of motion 4995 in the name of Derek Mackay on the financial resolution for the Air Departure Tax Scotland Bill. Point of order, Patrick Harvey.
I'm grateful, and I'd like to apologise, Presiding Officer, for giving you only very late notice of my intention to raise this point of order about the financial resolution. Rule 9.12.3 of our standing orders is the rule which requires a financial resolution in respect of certain bills, a financial resolution to be passed before a bill can progress past stage 1. I don't think that we're in breach of that rule in any way, but I would like to ask for you to reflect upon it. The rule says where a bill contains provisions which charge expenditure on the Scottish Consolidated Fund, or the likely effect of which would be to significantly increase expenditure charged on that fund, or give rise to significant expenditure payable out of that fund for a new purpose or for an existing purpose, that is the requirement for a financial resolution. We're today debating, however, a bill whose principal financial impacts are through taxation revenue, not through increased charges on the Consolidated Fund. Now, the existing rule is indeed triggered in respect of this bill, but the financial memorandum that the government has provided for us only addresses those additional expenditure aspects. It isn't required. The government isn't required to produce a financial memorandum that goes into the taxation revenue impacts of the financial impacts of a bill. Can I ask if you would consider whether this rule in our standing orders is still adequate now that we're in the era in which we legislate on bills such as this, whose principal financial impacts are on tax revenue?
Thanks very much, and thank you to Patrick Harvey for giving me some advance notice, very little advance notice of the point of order. In this particular case, there were other considerations in the bill which I had to consider and which did trigger the need for a financial resolution. So in this case, we will be able to go ahead this evening. However, Mr Harvey does raise a very interesting point about the wording of this standing order, which I will take under consideration. However, having said that, could I ask the Cabinet Secretary to move the motion 4995 on the financial resolution for the Air Departure Tax Scotland Bill?
Moved.
Thank you. The next item of business is consideration of legislative consent motion 5286 in the name of Michael Matheson on the Criminal Finances Bill. Could I ask Michael Matheson to move the motion? Moved. Thank you. There are 7 questions to be put as a result of today's business. I would remind members that if the amendment in the name of Ruth Davidson is agreed, then the other amendments fall. So the first question is that Amendment 5282.4 in the name of Ruth Davidson, which seeks to amend motion 5282 in the name of Nicola Sturgeon on child tax credit cuts be agreed. Are we all agreed? No. We're not agreed. We'll have a division and members may cast their votes now. The result of the vote on Amendment 5282.4 in the name of Ruth Davidson is yes 31, no 91. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. The next question is that Amendment 5282.1 in the name of Kezia Dugdale, which seeks to amend the motion in the name of the First Minister. Are we all agreed? Yes. We're not agreed. We'll move to a vote and members may cast their votes now. The result of the vote on the amendment in the name of Kezia Dugdale is yes 91, no 31. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore agreed. The next question is that Amendment 5282.2 in the name of Alison Johnson, which seeks to amend the motion in the name of the First Minister, be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We're not agreed. We'll move to a vote and members may cast their votes now. The result of the vote on the amendment in the name of Alison Johnson is yes 91, no 31. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore agreed. And the next question is that the motion in the name of Nicola Sturgeon as amended on child tax credit cuts be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We're not agreed. We'll move to a vote again and members may cast their votes now. The result of the vote on motion 5282 in the name of Nicola Sturgeon as amended is yes 91, no 31. There were no abstentions and the motion is therefore agreed. The next question is that motion 5283 in the name of Derek Mackay on the Air Departure Tax Scotland Bill at stage 1 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We're not agreed. We'll move to a division and members may cast their votes now. The result of the vote on motion 5283 in the name of Derek Mackay is yes 112, no 4. There were 6 abstentions and the motion is therefore agreed. The next question is that motion 4995 in the name of Derek Mackay on the financial resolution for the Air Departure Tax Scotland Bill be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. Are we all agreed? Yes. We're not agreed. We'll move to division and we'll cast our votes now. The result of the vote on the motion 4995 in the name of Derek Mackay is yes 111, no 4. There were 6 abstentions. The motion is therefore agreed. And the final question is that motion 5286 in the name of Michael Matheson on the Criminal Finances Bill be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. That concludes decision time. We'll now move on to a members' business debate in the name of Maurice Golden on WWF Earth Hour 2017. And we'll just take a few moments to change seats.
The next item of business is a members' business debate on motion 4248 in the name of Maurice Golden on WWF Earth Hour 2017. This debate will be concluded without any questions being put. With those members who wish to speak in the debate, press the request to speak buttons now. I call on Maurice Golden to open the debate. Mr Golden, 7 minutes or thereabouts, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. At 8:30 p.m. on the 25th of March, thousands of Scots joined millions around the world to mark Earth Hour. From all walks of life, they came together to highlight something that affects every man, woman and child on this planet: climate change. The concept of Earth Hour was started by my good friend Andy Ridley in Sydney in 2007. We worked on a world first, well actually a world second, with a circle scan measuring material flows in Glasgow. I could go on, but the debate today is about Earth Hour. And the first ever Earth Hour resulted in a 10% reduction on the electricity grid, saving 25,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide. But now it has grown into a global event. It is no exaggeration to say that climate change is one of the biggest challenges of our age. It affects everyone, everywhere, and every facet of our lives. It is fitting, therefore, that so many have come together to recognise that. In Scotland, the figures speak for themselves. Every local authority, more than 1,000 schools, hundreds of businesses and organisations, more than 24 public bodies, and almost 2/3 of MSPs took part to raise awareness of climate change. The global nature of the threat we face was evident as more than 3,000 landmarks around the world, such as Big Ben, the Eiffel Tower, the Sydney Opera House, dimmed their lights in support. In Scotland, we showed that we were part of this common struggle, with more than 160 landmarks joining in, such as the Kelpies, the Forth Road Bridge, and Clydebank's Titan Crane in the west of Scotland. My Twitter post that evening had me smiling and beaming into the mobile phone camera, looking like an extra from The Shining. But recognising local involvement is important, because this is a fight in which we all have a part to play. And I am proud that 4 local authorities in the West have recognised by the WWF for their exceptional support. East Renfrewshire, East Dunbartonshire, North Ayrshire and West Dunbartonshire all received WWF's Super Local Authority badge, and I congratulate each one of them. Most importantly, though, was the almost 1,200 schools across Scotland, including many across the west of Scotland, that took part in Earth Hour, showing enormous creativity in highlighting this serious issue. It's Scotland's children who will live with climate change and who will soon take up the torch in tackling it. Their involvement is testament to both the level of awareness and concern there is amongst young people and about climate change. The strength of feeling was evident earlier this year when a William Wood High School pupil in East Renfrewshire, a young lady named Rumeza Zubari, won Young Scot WWF Poetry Contest. Her poem lamented a world that might be, where climate change has ravished our environment. It is a stark call to action for all of us and serves as a reminder that we are working to ensure that our children inherit a better world than we did. We have made progress, and there is much to be proud of here in Scotland when it comes to combating climate change. Since 1990, we have reduced emissions by almost 50%, met our emissions targets for the first time, and seen renewables generate more than half of Scotland's electricity needs. Last week, Britain as a whole went a day without coal power for the first time since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Perhaps the most important statistic, though, is that the 2009 Climate Change Act was passed unanimously, underlining that climate change cuts across party lines and has the wide support vital to take on the challenge of this magnitude. That is also evident in today's debate, and I welcome the opportunity to hear from other members across the chamber. But we mustn't allow the progress we have made so far to cloud our judgment with regard to the task ahead of us. Tackling climate change is more than cutting energy use or reducing emissions. It's about developing a sustainable future. The draft climate change plan sets out some bold objectives for Scotland. That is to be welcomed. We must also recognise that simply setting targets doesn't get the job done. There needs to be a clear path to each target that allows for monitoring, analysis, and ultimately completion. We must increase our recycling rate. We must reduce transport emissions, which haven't budged for around 30 years. We need to heat our homes more efficiently. We must engage better with farmers and landowners to create sustainable land management. And our economy needs to be more circular by maximising our nation's resources. Scotland needs those ideas because the old ways aren't working anymore, and our success rests on no one person, political party or campaign group, but rather the cooperation and hard work of each of us. Earth Hour reminds us that our world is as fragile as it is incredible. In her poem, Rumeza says, "Our world is evolving, changing, and we are changing it. For the sake of our children, let's make sure we are changing it for the better." I move the motion in my name.
Thank you very much, Mr Golden. Now the open debate, speeches of 4 minutes, please. Graham Day to be followed by Finlay Carson. Mr Day, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As the member who led the Parliament's last Earth Hour debate in 2015, let me congratulate Maurice Golden on opting to lead his first members' debate on this subject. And let me advise him that he joins a select band of MSPs. Much to my surprise, I discovered today that he, myself and Shirley-Ann Somerville are the only members to have taken the opportunity to highlight this hugely significant and symbolic event through a members' business motion debate. And Earth Hour is a hugely significant symbolic event. March 25 saw the 11th annual Earth Hour take place. 11 years of people, businesses and landmarks around the world turning off their lights at 8:30 p.m. to focus minds on climate change. This year, as we've heard, an unprecedented 187 countries and territories took part, over 3,000 landmarks switched off their lights, and millions of individuals, businesses and organisations across 7 continents
took part. Yes, this is a symbolic gesture that needs backed up by firm action, but whether through the act of turning off your lights or walking past homes, businesses or landmarks without their usual glow, it does make you stop and think. And if considering the issues leads to behavioural change individually and collectively, then Earth Hour has achieved its purpose. Buildings in my constituency which participated this year included the iconic Arbroath Abbey and a multitude of schools. I am of course delighted that we here in Scotland are making good progress in relation to our climate change targets, and that the Scottish Government is committed to raising the bar still further through the Climate Plan and the forthcoming bill, because far-reaching action is required across the planet to safeguard it for future generations. This generation was slow to react. We're playing catch-up. We need to ensure the next generation is fully alive to the challenge the planet faces. And that's why the participation in Earth Hour of young people is so important. I recognise, of course, that pupils, or staff for that matter, won't have been in schools on a Saturday night, but there will have been lessons educating them about why their school is participating. There will be important classes about the potential impacts of climate change, encompassing the message that they can do a little, change a lot. Members who've heard me speak before about tackling climate change will know that I'm a firm believer, as others are, that behavioural change is a key component. As we're aware, participating in Earth Hour is a voluntary act. It's about people taking action because they believe that we as a society have to. WWF, the campaign group behind Earth Hour, has on its website a number of what it sees as Earth Hour heroes. I want to tell the story of one, Ahmed from the Maldives. As members may know, the Maldives is a nation made up of a number of low-lying islands, which is majorly threatened by climate change. Ahmed, in his day job, crunches numbers at a broadcasting company. He first found out about Earth Hour in 2009 and quickly worked out that if it could become an ideal platform to revive a much-needed national debate on the climate. He secured partnerships with the government, organisations and the Scout Association of the Maldives, and over the years has managed to engage schools on every island in the Maldives today. Who can forget the sight from 2009 when the government of the Maldives held a cabinet meeting underwater to highlight to the world the threat that climate change poses to this country? The Cabinet Secretary will no doubt be relieved that I'm not calling on our Cabinet to spend half an hour on the seabed communicating with whiteboards and hand signals in order to conduct government business, entertaining though that might be. But that action by President Nasheed's government really did highlight the whole climate change issue and in a memorable way. Presiding Officer, here's to 8:30 p.m. on the 24th of March 2018, next year's Earth Hour, by which point we should have a much clearer picture of how the nations of this planet are going to live up to the commitments they made to tackling climate change in Paris. Of the 195 signatories to the agreement, only 143 countries thus far have indicated what they will be doing up to 2030. So as well as celebrating the symbolism of Earth Hour tonight, let's be clear also that we need progress made on the actions planned across the globe to tackle climate change. Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much, Mr Day. I call Finlay Carson to be followed by Claudia Beamish. Mr Carson, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'd like to begin to thank Maurice and congratulate him for securing this debate on Earth Hour. Climate change is one of the greatest challenges we face. It threatens us in so many forms. Heavier rain, hotter weather, rising sea levels are the real effects that we can all notice over the years. And of course, there is the threat to our environment and wildlife. Hotter summers with more drought will undoubtedly have impact on our natural environment and potentially upon agriculture. We all have a duty to the next generation to leave Scotland in a better state than we found it. Earth Hour is a fantastic initiative by the World Wildlife Foundation to raise awareness of climate change and provide an opportunity for us to think about ways in which we can address climate change. And the point is we can all do our bit. This year's Earth Hour on the 25th of March saw thousands of schools, landmarks, public buildings and homes across Scotland turn their lights off for an hour. We all have a responsibility to do our bit, whether that be recycling our household waste, turning lights off when we aren't in the room, thinking about whether we really need to print that email or that briefing off, or small things which are not only good for the environment but save a few pennies in the process. I was very privileged to spend Earth Hour at Murray's Monument. I'm sure an area that the Presiding Officer is very familiar with. I drove from Minnegaff up into the centre of Europe's first dark sky park. to the biggest forest park in the United Kingdom, and I'm sure the Cabinet Secretary will agree a fine example of what could be Scotland's third national park. I'm proud that my local authority, Dumfries and Galloway, was awarded a Super Local Authority badge for their level of participation in the 2017 WWF Earth Hour. And I would like to take this opportunity to give special mention to some of the schools in my constituency who took part: Shawhead, Closeburn, Dalbeattie, Wigton, Dromore Primary Schools and Stranraer Academy. It's absolutely fantastic to see that our young people are getting engaged with such important initiatives. It's also incumbent on all of us as parliamentarians to ensure that we are setting ambitious programmes towards a low-carbon Scotland that will be so vital to our children's future. The Scottish Parliament recently scrutinised the Scottish Government's draft climate change plan. A range of weaknesses in the current draft have been highlighted by all 4 committees involved. The WWF said of the plan, although the plan presents an often strong description of a low-carbon economy in 2030, there is a consistent absence of sufficient specific policies in almost every sector to ensure we achieve our climate targets through to 2032. It's simply not enough to paint a strong narrative without specific policies to ensure that we achieve these targets. It's incumbent on the Cabinet Secretary to fully consider the recommendations made and come back to Parliament later this year with a robust and ambitious plan that has the policies to back up the rhetoric. Deputy Presiding Officer, I'm delighted to have had the opportunity to participate in the debate on Earth Hour and the importance of recognising and tackling the many real concerns that climate change presents. It's all too easy for us to forget or shrug off our responsibilities to protect this planet for the next generation, and we cannot allow that to happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I call Claudia Beamish to be followed by Mark Ruskell. Ms Beamish.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In the words of WWF Scotland, Earth Hour 2017 provided a moment for us all to think about how much more we can do to address climate change. It is such a simple and yet profoundly brilliant idea. It is unlikely that people will spend that hour alone. Much more likely is that they will be involving those who they are spending the weekend or evening with, and just as likely that they might invite people to join them to make a party with a purpose out of it. In my case, this was a candlelit climate change chat with partner Michael, daughter Freya, son-in-law Talon Chai, who's Thai, and 2-year-old grandson Maka. Actually, an hour can feel like a long time in a really good way. Part of the power of it was the sense that people were doing similar across the world. It felt hopeful and inspiring. And I want to thank WWF for the organisation this takes year after year for, in their words, a symbol of care for our brilliant planet. I also want to thank Maurice Golden for his debate about, as he put it, a common struggle. Climate change concerns push us all, whatever party we belong to, and indeed none. And this debate gives us further opportunity to share thoughts on the way forward and to share some special projects. I want to share 3 with you tonight, all from the last week, and ask how us as politicians can help even more. On Saturday, I was honoured to cut the ribbon to open a yurt for Peebles Can. The yurt was to be a shelter for those helping in the community garden, and one mum told me of her daughter's enthusiasm that morning. Olive's face lit up as we entered the community garden. She's normally shy of new things, but not here. Non-stop drumming for 20 minutes, and from this we decided to go every month and make use of the vegetable beds and help out wherever we can. This year, Peebles Can was lucky in getting money from the Climate Challenge Fund for Grow, Cook, Build and Own, which is their project to empower local people and families to build a sustainable Peebles. And the Climate Challenge Fund is indeed a large amount of money, £9.97 million. Recognising this value, let's all fight for even more next time, so projects like this can be the norm across Scotland. I see the Cabinet Secretary smiling. Let's also ensure that the Scottish Government behaviour change commitments in the draft climate change plan are acted on robustly. On Saturday evening, I went to see a play at the Biggar Corn Exchange, a one-woman play performed by Edie Goodwin. It was called What the Frack. Edie says, as a young person, I see fracking as a hugely important issue, one that could have an immeasurably detrimental impact on health, democracy, life as a whole on this land which we share. So at the start of December, I found out that a public consultation was going to take place, and I decided my contribution to the debate would be through theatre. I decided I was going to write a play. This indeed she did, and Edie's creation shows how individual fortitude and creativity can make a difference. She believed she had to do something to tell the story of fracking so far and the dangers as she sees them, to counteract the power of big corporations. As politicians, we must indeed listen to people just as much as to big money here and globally. And finally, actually tomorrow, South Lanarkshire and East Kilbride TUC is taking a motion as amended by PCS Union to the STUC Congress. I quote, "Congress believes that a transition to a low-carbon economy must be a just transition. This includes looking to support those communities and nations across the world that will be most immediately at risk. It also means ensuring that workers and communities in Scotland need to be assured that jobs will be created in the low-carbon industries as part of this transition. In the spirit of Earth Hour, let's be sure that this happens." Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Beamish. I call Mark Ruskell to be followed by Ash Denham.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer, and can I thank Maurice Golden for bringing this debate to the Chamber this evening after a somewhat challenging afternoon for the environment in this Parliament. And I'd like to congratulate WWF and welcome the efforts of all those participating in Earth Hour this year. To have all 32 councils, 130 landmarks, 25 public bodies, 48 community events, hundreds of businesses and 1,000 schools involved in Scotland is a major, major achievement. And with 172 countries and 7,000 cities participating worldwide, it's now a long way from that inaugural Big Flick event in Sydney back in 2007. But I think it is important to recognise what Earth Hour is and what it isn't, because the event has had its critics over the years, including from the wider Green movement. Now, it's clearly not a way to reduce the nation's energy consumption by a huge amount, with most participating nations reducing demand by around 4% during the hour itself. But to focus on this is really to miss the point, because what Earth Hour delivers is strong awareness and debate, and it has also inspired action. Russian activists used Earth Hour to publicise a petition to protect Russian oceans from oil contamination. It gained over 120,000 signatures and eventually led to a new law being passed. Raising awareness, even if only for a single hour, can be a springboard for other forms of direct action. Now, there are those who see sitting in darkness for an hour as a bleak, back-to-the-cave anti-technology message. Now, I acknowledge that it could be seen that way, but for most, it's about stopping for a moment, not just to reflect on the impact of energy use, but also to reflect on how we take technology's positive contribution often for granted. Then, of course, there's the debate about power and decision-making that Earth Hour often leads to. Switching off lights around homes and monuments will clearly not decarbonise an energy system run by corporations tempered through government-regulated markets. But even as symbolic a gesture as switching off appliances does begin the journey towards democratisation of our energy system. The smart meter rollout across the UK builds on that simple act of switching off, growing awareness of patterns of demand in our homes and businesses. And from that step comes the design of white goods and electric cars, for example, that can balance supply and demand through smart systems linked to renewable energy generation in the building and through the national grid. And from that step, we can build solutions on a community scale, using generation from wind farms to solar and hydro, providing financial benefits that could be so much more widespread. And alongside renewable electricity, we can finally start delivering meaningful progress on renewable heating, taking waste heat currently warming the sky to homes currently living in fuel poverty. And with all these positive directions for energy, there are real opportunities for individuals, consumers, tenants and councils to be driving progress on their own or collectively through co-ops and municipal energy companies. A true energy democracy could build on that historic legacy of Tom Johnston, who brought power to the Glens and delivered Scotland's first renewables revolution. And in so doing, we build the political support for governments worldwide to switch investment away from the infrastructure that locks in emissions for generations to come, reinvesting low-carbon infrastructure from railways to renewables that will allow us as citizens to always make the right choices. Deputy Presiding Officer, that's what I see in the darkness of an Earth Hour every year. It's a bright future with energy citizens and the well-being of future generations at its heart. And I look forward to it becoming a reality.
Thank you very much. I call Ash Denham to be followed by John Scott. John Scott's the last speaker in the open debate. Ms Denham.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I'd like to start by extending my thanks to Maurice Golden for securing chamber time to discuss this issue. And as we've heard from the member, thousands in Scotland join millions around the world in turning off their lights to stand up for protecting the planet. Here in Edinburgh, many landmarks, organisations, businesses and people took part in WWF's Earth Hour. Over 1,000 Scottish schools participated, such as Craigentinnery Primary School in my own constituency, Edinburgh Eastern. And for students there and across Scotland, Earth Hour provided that opportunity to spend the day learning about environmental issues and how important it is to protect our planet. Edinburgh restaurants shut off their lights, holding special events by candlelight. Edinburgh residents took to Twitter to post photos of themselves celebrating Earth Hour by reading or doing work by candlelight. And Edinburgh's greatest landmark, Edinburgh Castle, went dark just after lighting up green in support of the environment. And that was on top of 81 members of the Scottish Parliament who took part in Earth Hour. And it's reassuring that something as vital as protecting our environment and fighting climate change is that shared priority amongst all the parties and also the constituents that we represent. And obviously Scotland has done a tremendous amount to be a leader in environmental stewardship and also in tackling climate change. Reducing the amount of energy we use is, of course, a really good way to contribute to fighting climate change. And by way of personal example, I've changed on this myself over the years. And I remember this from when I was a child in the 1980s. I had this friend whose father was really quite scary, and that's possibly because he was a black belt in karate. But also because he had this absolutely iron-cast, lights-off in an empty room policy. And he would shout really quite aggressively at all his family members to make sure that they all complied with this. And I must say that at the time, as a child, I compared what was going on in their home to what was going on in my own home when the lights were all on. Nobody seemed to be too bothered about that. And I think at the time, I felt quite glad that my family lived the way they did. But fast forward a few decades, and I now religiously turn off all the lights in the empty rooms. And although my beseeching my kids to do the same seems to, at the moment, have fallen on deaf ears so far, judging by the amount of time that I spend going around the house after them, turning off the bathroom light, unwatched TVs and unused radios, it will sink in eventually, I'm hoping. So it's reassuring that if I can change, even if it took me a while, then it gives me hope that we can expect further behavioural change on this issue. So Earth Hour is that opportunity to reaffirm our commitment to protecting the planet. And I commend all the MSPs who took part in it, and also WWF for working in close partnership with the Parliament. It has reinvigorated our commitment in Edinburgh, across Scotland, across the world, to support the environment. So let's all continue to do that, to show partnership on this issue, and to ensure also that Scotland remains a global leader on the environment. Thank you.
Thank you. I call John Scott.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I begin by declaring an interest as a farmer and a food producer with interest in climate change and environmental enhancement protection going back over at least the last 25 years. Can I also congratulate Maurice Golden on securing this debate today, again allowing him to demonstrate his and the Conservative Party's enthusiasm for proactive environmental improvement and addressing climate change. And can also thank WWF for their helpful briefing note. So, Presiding Officer, for me, the journey began in the 1990s as the chairman of our Ayrshire Farming and Wildlife Advisory Group, known affectionately as FWAG, and that is why I was very much in favour of the Earth Hour 2017, and I want to congratulate all of those in Ayr constituency, particularly, but Ayrshire generally, and across Scotland who took part in Earth Hour 2017. I want to congratulate Conservative-led South Ayrshire Council for their 6-year campaign on this issue, which is why they have been awarded a Super Local Authority badge. More importantly, perhaps, I want to congratulate all those who took part in my Ayr constituency, particularly our enthusiastic and dynamic school pupils and their teachers. And from the list I have been given, it appears that almost all primary and secondary schools in Ayr, Prestwick and Troon took part in some way in marking the Earth Hour, too long to mention them all. In addition, South Ayrshire Council staff across Ayr, Prestwick and Troon, as well as NHS Ayrshire and Arran staff, took part in this now significant event in the South Ayrshire calendar, and my congratulations to them too. And all of the events and projects are important because they encourage the awareness of our local people of what a magnificent place we live in, but also perhaps inspire some of our school children to go out and make a real difference to the future of our planet. That what needs to be done in meeting our climate change targets is beyond doubt, and inspiring our school leavers and students to be part of the generation that will have to define itself by tackling climate change will not just be about self-interest on their part, but also about the very future of the Earth as we know it today. So low-carbon policies are more essential than ever before, and we will need determined commitment from us all to tackle emissions from areas where we have thus far been less than successful in Scotland. Insulation of homes and buildings must continue to be improved, and money spent in this area will provide many bangs for the same buck by reducing not just fuel poverty, but also by improving all areas of physical and mental health, as well as reducing emissions. The encouragement of the use of electric vehicles has the potential to deliver much-needed reduced emissions in transport, and a combination of regulation and investment to develop this is overdue, particularly in the area of short journeys. And I was surprised to be told just recently that using an electric quad bike on farm could save up to 3,500 years per bike per year by not using petrol. Remarkable. Which again takes me back to agricultural and food production, where I know more can be achieved, in my view, by the continued development of cooperation and collaboration, not just in production of food from farming, but also by better off-farm supply chain management and collaboration. Scotland Food and Drink, under James Withers' leadership, is successfully finding the markets for our finished food and drink production. But the difficulty for food processors will shortly become the sourcing of sustainably and economically produced authentic Scottish produce to meet the growing demand from our high-quality end products. So there is much to be done in developing sustainable low-carbon policies, particularly in the fields of insulation, transport and food production. And this is indeed a very real challenge, area of work and an opportunity for future generations. That is why the catalytic and inspirational effect of the Earth Hour is therefore hugely worthwhile and vital, and I again congratulate Maurice Golden on bringing this motion to Parliament today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Scott. I call on Rosanna Cunningham to close the Government Cabinet Secretary. 7 minutes or thereabout, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I have to admit wasn't quite sure whether to commiserate or congratulate Maurice Golden on tonight's debate. Commiserate him for being a month late, or congratulate him on being 11 months early. So I'm not quite sure whether today's debate will do to count for 2 years' worth. Graham Day is obviously the one keeping the stats on this. But I am surprised to find it's only the third such debate in the history of Parliament. The success of Earth Hour is obvious. I don't think I need to repeat some of the stats that have already been referred to. Participation of hundreds of millions of people across the planet show that success. And obviously in Scotland this year, as part of Earth Hour, a massive 4,600 people backed a strong Scottish climate action plan for the Scottish Government, which is a strong show of support for the Government's continued action on climate change. So I'm delighted to add my own congratulations to WWF and to everyone who made this year's Earth Hour a success. My own house is always in darkness for Earth Hour, well, apart from a few candles maybe. And it isn't really a difficulty at all to have that hour like that. Mark Ruskell was correct to point out that it sometimes reminds us what we take for granted in terms of technology. Now, the Scottish Government's support for Earth Hour this year enabled WWF Scotland to coordinate engagement across the country, from local government and the wider public sector to schools and local community groups, and we've heard lots of examples here this evening. And the Scottish Government, of course, switched off St Andrews House, Victoria Quay, Atlantic Quay, Saughton House. Glasgow City Council too are to be commended for their choice of Earth Hour to launch their partnership with Pittsburgh, a partnership to share experiences and learning of how to create more sustainable and low-carbon cities. And I thought that was a fine way to mark the occasion with a kind of action that perhaps people weren't thinking about. Everybody's thinking about switching off. In that sense, Glasgow Council found a way, metaphorically speaking, to switch on, which I think was very good too. So I think Maurice Golden was right to emphasise the enormous buy-in. As he recognised, Scotland is a world leader in tackling climate change with strong progress against ambitious statutory targets. And it is no small thanks to the cross-party nature of the commitment in this chamber that we have made this achievement. Scotland is actually only one of a small number of countries who have, in fact, enshrined long-term emissions reduction targets in legislation. It isn't as normal as we might assume because we've done it. It is actually quite rare. And only one of the EU 15 states, Sweden, has achieved greater reductions than Scotland. People have talked about the draft climate change plan. We have set out proposing driving emissions down further by 66% in 2032. The plan, together with the energy strategy and a new climate change bill in response to the Paris Agreement, will deliver a low-carbon transition for Scotland, which promotes social inclusion and sustainable growth. But of course, as a number of members have also referred to, we can never pause in this. We have to keep moving on this one. The Paris Agreement in 2015 has seen 195 countries adopting the first ever universal, legally binding global climate deal. And despite the slightly depressing news that occasionally emanates from the White House in this particular policy area, it is worth remembering that there are other American actors with different agendas. The First Minister met with Governor Jerry Brown of California earlier this month, and they've agreed to work together to support the Under 2 coalition, now, by the way, covering over 1 billion people and a third of the global economy, to help prepare for a major summit in 2018. That's important. Earth Hour demonstrates that when we act collectively, we do have the power to make a difference. And that's true internationally as well as at the local and individual level. But of course, influencing everyday actions is key to delivering our climate change ambitions. We know the key climate actions where individuals and households can really make a difference. These range from home energy and travel to avoiding food waste and reuse. And the outcomes and associated actions in the climate change plan must be supported and owned by the people of Scotland. We know that the majority of people don't discuss climate change on a regular basis, although many are actively involved in climate-friendly behaviours at home, work or in their communities. As part of ongoing engagement with the public, we initiated a series of climate conversations across Scotland starting in summer last year, just to take the temperature of public views on climate change and actions that might be needed to tackle it. And this pioneering approach is the first of its kind in the UK and does represent a step change in our approach towards public engagement. These conversations are continuing across Scotland, and we have developed free resources, including a how-to guide to help as many organisations and community groups as possible to participate in the climate conversations. Now, Claudia Beamish talked about the Climate Challenge Fund. Since 2008, the Scottish Government has given funding of around £85.8 million to 622 communities across Scotland to take forward local action on climate change. And I actually don't think there's anything like it anywhere else in the world. And that's another thing that we need to remind ourselves of. We are sometimes pioneering in this country. Now, Maurice Golden quoted some poetry, and I intend to close with a very short MacDermid poem as well, that some may know and some may not, but I think is quite appropriate for this particular debate. It's called the Bonnie Brookett Bairn. Mars is braw and cramacy, Venus in a green silk gown, the auld moon shakes her gowden feathers, their starry talks a wheen o' blethers, nane for thee a thochty sparin, earth, thou bonny Brookett bairn. But greet, and in your tears you'll drown the hail Clonjamfrey. Fixing climate change will stop the earth green. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. I hope the official report got that bit. And that concludes the debate, and I now close this meeting of Parliament.